everybody as you're joining. Do send your messages on the chat. But I think we should start without more ado, because I know that we've got a lot to get through today on this webinar. So if everybody is good with that, Noor, I think you should kick off. Hello, I'm Jane Vowles.
I'm Pami Natterson.
I am Sheila Judah.
I'm Kirsten Patterson.
I am Kamala Rampersad de Silva.
This is Kali Chui. As CEO of this institute, I am pleased to be collaborating with other female leaders
who are working incredibly hard to improve governance practices in their regions.
It is noteworthy that even as the challenges of COVID-19 are impacting our governance practices,
in many boardrooms, women's voices are absent,
Silent,
or go unheard.
Yet, it is clear that the economic impact of COVID-19 is devastating.
not only in terms of the estimated $90 trillion lost globally,
But as we see happening in some countries,
emotions are running high with respect to dealing with very fundamental decisions.
like economic recovery,
Reopening borders,
Vaccinations,
And freedom of choice.
we cannot afford to lose out on the contribution women can make.
to solve some of these problems.
We welcome you.
as you join us in this 3-part series
on women in governance to bring positive change.
positive change.
Positive change.
A change where we embrace all our voices
so that we can all contribute effectively to making governance worldwide more effective,
inclusive,
And diverse.
In other words, let's stop competing.
And begin collaborating.
Let's help solve many of these problems.
So, hello everyone, members of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, GCC Board Directors Institute, the Hong Kong Institute of Directors, Institute of Directors New Zealand, the Institute of Directors South Africa, and the Mauritius Institute of Directors, members of the press as well, ladies and gentlemen. When a woman rules, streams run uphill. With this Ethiopian proverb, I would like to wish you a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where you are. I am Sheila Judah, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Mauritius Institute of Directors. It is my pleasure to welcome you to an historical event as we begin the second round of the Women in Governance series. As you would have seen from our opening video, this 3-part conference is organized by Jane Vowles, Executive Director from the GCC Board of Directors, Kamala Rampersad de Silva, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, Carlisle Su, CEO of the Hong Kong Institute of Directors, Kirsten Patterson of the New Zealand Institute of Directors, Pami Natterson, CEO of the South Africa Institute of Directors, and myself from the Mauritius Institute of Directors. As the saying goes, thinking is wonderful, but the experience is even more wonderful. And thus, the coming together of these 6 institutes has been a truly unique and rich journey. A recent study conducted by the Harvard Business Review states that the integration of female leaders at the highest level of an organization impacts its approach to innovation, and ultimately suggests that including more women in executive decision-making may lead firms to consider a wider variety of value creation strategies. Though Africa is leading gender equality in the private sector, by topping the number of women on corporate boards worldwide, the presence of women on boards and subcommittees in Mauritius remains rare, for instance. Only 10.1% of the 523 directorships reported are held by women. Out of 156 countries, South Africa was ranked 18th, Mauritius 110th as per the Global Gender Gap Index 2021 of the World Economic Forum. A study for the Gulf reveals a 2% women representation on listed companies. According to a McKinsey & Company report, 1 in 4 members for African companies are now women, a higher rate than Europe's at 23%. Despite the slow progress on this current trajectory, it will take 135 years to close the gender gap worldwide. I must say that the impact of COVID might even worsen this gap. Today, as we launch the conference, we would be discussing 3 major themes: corporate governance and why gender matters was held on the 29th of July. Women on boards will be tackled today, while governance policies that support women will be dealt with on August 11th. Hopefully, today is going to be a great day for us, as we have the opportunity to enrich our knowledge and insights on this crucial topic. And thank you for making the time to watch this online session. Allow me to share some housekeeping rules which are key for the smooth running of this event. So to keep background noise to a minimum, make sure you mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Video camera, we would appreciate that this is enabled only for the presenters. We would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please share them on the chat box and we will be glad to assist. As you would imagine, not all may be addressed, but we would certainly try to deal with as many possible with the time allowed. So here is the agenda of today and some salient points of the agenda. Firstly, we have Jane Balz from GCCBDI, who will introduce our guest speaker, Helen Brandt. Then we will have Permi Nathisen from IOD South Africa, who will then proceed with the introduction of our panel moderator. And this you can see on the slide there. Then around 11:50 UAE and MRU time, and you have the corresponding time, SE time there, we will have the panel discussion with QA to our panelists. To proceed eventually with Q&A from the audience. And then we will kick off with session 2, where Permi will introduce our guest speaker for the session, Mutlaq Al-Murshid. After the guest speaker speech, I will introduce the moderator, who will then further present the panelists. The second panel discussion is due to start at 13:10 hours UAE and Mauritian time, and you have the corresponding time there on the slide. Maybe we can move to the next slide. And to note that each panelist will be allocated 5 minutes to state their views, and this is applicable for both sessions. Finally, Jane will proceed with the closing up of today's session. So with this great agenda, I look forward to all the many stimulating conversations which will follow. So without delay, I now invite Jane to introduce our guest speaker, Helen Brandt. Over to you, Jane. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me because my internet connection is not great this morning, but let me know if you've got any problems. It's my great pleasure to be introducing our guest speaker, Helen Brandt. She's the Chief Executive of ACCA, which is the global body for professional accountants, and she has been in that post since 2008. Helen has built her career within professional bodies and has considerable experience and knowledge of the 176 markets within which ACCA currently operates. So Helen, the global spread of today's event will fit you perfectly. She's a founding member of the International Integrated Reporting Council and now serves as a co-vice chair on that board. She's a member of the UK government's Professional and Business Services Council, and she was also appointed to the UK DIT's Trade Advisory Group on Professional Advisory Services in August 2020. She's one of the few women to lead a global professional body. She holds a BA in politics from the University of Exeter. She was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours in June 2011 for services to accountancy and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Exeter in December 2017. And above all, I have to add, she's a Liverpool football supporter, so she gets my vote. All right. Helen, without more ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you and to have you with us today to talk on this important topic of women on boards and to have your views. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Jane. That piece about Liverpool Football Club is almost always the most important in a global audience. So hello, everyone, whatever time of day it is in your part of the world. And thank you so much for giving me the chance to share time with you all. I'm certain it's going to be a really brilliant event and a great day. As Jane said, I'm Chief Executive of ACCA, global body for professional accountants, and we bring together 233,000 members and 536,000 future members across those 178 countries. And our vision is to develop the accountancy profession the world needs, providing finance and business professionals and leaders who are respected and recognised everywhere for their dedication to our values of integrity, inclusion, and innovation. And we work for the public good, leading the global accountancy profession by creating opportunity. And for your discussions today, I really felt that that value around inclusion and the whole purpose we have as an organisation to create opportunity were particularly important. So it's a real pleasure to join you today to discuss that theme, women in boardrooms, why we need more women in boardrooms, and how do we create the change to make it happen. I want to start by sharing an interesting list from Wikipedia. You can find interesting things on Wikipedia, and it features a rolling update of the world's top 182 businesses. Among the facts it sets down are the names of their chief executives, and this is the bit that gives us a clue about why our theme today remains so relevant. The fact is, you have to look very closely to find the names of women on the list. There are 10 of them, 10 women and 172 men. In fact, there are the same number of men named James on the list than there are women named anything. If we pull the camera back a little further and take a wider view, the picture doesn't get much prettier for women at the top levels of business. Of the Forbes 500 list of the world's biggest companies, only 41 have CEOs who are women. That's 8%. And that only makes sense if you believe that men are 12.5 times smarter than women, 12.5 times more talented than women, or work 12.5 times harder than women. And as you would expect, the picture is pretty patchy all around the world. In a study of leading economies by the Catalyst Group, which advises businesses on advancing the inclusion of women in the workplace, France has the highest ratio of female directors. 44 of board members are women. And that's partly because France has had a legal quota for women on board since 2010. At the other end of the scale, Japan reported just 8% of women directors. Interestingly, the study also showed an increase in women's reputation in every country, if only small. So small, but an increase nonetheless. So there is something telling us that we're on the right trajectory. But it is clear that women are underrepresented at the top of businesses. And I want to spend some time today talking about where we are on this issue, why it needs to change, and how we can play our part in making that change happen. For me, it begins with the truth that change is already happening, too slowly, but there is perceptible change nonetheless. There are lots of factors which are accelerating the slight increase in the number of women in the boardroom, and I'll mention a few of them. The biggest one is something that's difficult to pin down and hard to measure, but it can be classed as cultural change. Put simply, it means that there is wider acceptance in societies everywhere that women should have equal access to opportunity as men in their work, including in the boardroom, if that's where their ambitions and skills take them, and in their life. Old attitudes from the ages past which discriminate against women are increasingly viewed as outmoded, outdated, and just plain wrong. That has happened in our lifetimes, and it's a generational shift. The best businesses know this. They know that to ignore the right of women to claim equal opportunities to men in every walk of life is to risk serious reputational damage. In that sense, the right of women to take the place which their abilities deserve is a business question as much as a moral question. Far-sighted companies are increasingly aware that to stay relevant, to stay respected, they must accurately reflect the aspirations and the attitudes of all their stakeholders, which includes their investors, their customers, and their staff. There's growing evidence in recent years that more women on boards equals better financial performance. A McKinsey report in 2018, based on results from 1,000 companies across 12 countries, showed a link between numbers of female executives and profitability. It ranks the firms according to numbers of women on their executive teams, and it concluded that the top quarter were 21% more likely to make above average profits in their market than the bottom quarter, and that the difference was consistent right across the world. In other words, the report found that having gender diversity on executive teams positively correlated with higher profitability across geographies. One of the most interesting trends emerging now is a changing mood among big institutional investors on this issue and a shift in how they make decisions. There is a growing willingness to hold businesses to account across a range of measures that extend way beyond profitability. Increasingly, they demand action on sustainability, on corporate and social responsibility, and on diversity, including, crucially for our theme today, gender equality. This is part of a wider movement in favour of corporate reporting, which gives as full a picture as possible of a business's long-term impact on society in the world. It is revolutionising how we judge success, and it is changing the way that we keep score in business. Another huge factor, as has already been mentioned in this, has been the pandemic. COVID-19 has changed the world forever. Its effects reach into every corner of life. It has raised questions about how we live our lives and how we carry on business, and that includes the issue of gender equality at all levels of the workplace. At ACCA, we commissioned a global survey into the effects of the pandemic on women especially, and it was clear it was disproportionately more damaging for women, both economically and socially. Our report in March this year, Gender Responsive Budgeting, brought a valuable female perspective to the crisis. For women, it has been a story of job losses, a surge in the burden of unpaid care, and increasing economic dependence on men. But as we emerge from the pandemic, in some ways, the employment landscape for women is changing for the better, and that includes more opportunities at the top of businesses and potentially greater access to board roles. The pandemic, of course, triggered a revolution in remote working and in more flexible working, which in time has the potential to liberate countless women to combine home lives and careers more easily than ever before. There's been an explosion in remote education and remote study, and we've worked to drive this forward. It has raised the chances for untold numbers of women to pursue a professional career, especially for those women who have traditionally been excluded from professional education by the simple fact of geography or by cultural and domestic pressures. I believe that the pandemic has also accelerated businesses' realization that boards need new skills, new attitudes, new voices to make sense of a new reality of a post-pandemic world. That includes qualities which aren't necessarily exclusive to women, but certainly don't exclude women either. Communication skills, diverse expertise in climate change and sustainable finance, health and safety, digitalization, data privacy, and important cognitive skills such as decision-making and problem-solving. The question of greater access to professional education for women is important for its own sake, but it also speaks to our theme of women in the boardroom. The numbers of women entering professional and business life is poised to explode in the coming generation, and this will lead to an irresistible surge of female leaders bound for the boardroom. Everything we know from ACCA's extensive research into Gen Z, the generation of 18 to 25-year-olds who are entering professional and business life now, tells us that they are ambitious, fearless, and hungry for change, regardless of gender. I've seen this with my own eyes in the accountancy profession. Before the pandemic halted most travel, I remember speaking at an event for young women finance professionals in Islamabad. I looked around that room, every seat filled, and sensed the ambition and the fierce determination to build a career that lived in every individual there. In a society where girls' education has traditionally lagged behind boys, they saw finance as a world where they could get on and make a life and career free from preconceptions about gender. It was deeply inspiring. And I knew in that moment that the future of finance leadership was female. I also knew that this trend for women to choose finance will swell the numbers of women on boards in the future, because the finance function is increasingly influential at the top levels of business. The status of finance has elevated in corporate life. The role of the CFO has grown more prestigious in the last couple of decades, and finance has emerged as a highly desirable role for smart leaders with vision and ambition. The main expertise of this new breed of leader is creating strategy rather than reports, in bringing a broader intelligence and insight to business, and driving good decision-making rather than offering a snapshot of performance at a particular time. CFOs are increasingly at the right hand of CEOs and are frequently stepping up into that number one job. I believe that finance leaders will continue on this upward trajectory, and that women who are flooding into the profession will increasingly step into the star roles of the corporate world. This is reflected in our experience around the world, where accountancy is an increasingly popular choice for young women. A majority of our students, 59%, are women. And I have to say that the popularity of accountancy amongst women in general, and of ACCA in particular, is no accident. It's a result of more than a century of dedication to equality of opportunity. ACCA was founded in 1904 to open up the chance of a useful and interesting career to people who'd been excluded from professional life previously, and that of course included women. We were the first professional accountancy body in the world to admit women, and our first female member was named Ethel Ayres Purdy. For us, Ethel Purdy represents far more than a footnote in a history book. Our history shapes our present and it guides our future. We remember Ethel in particular every March on International Women's Day, when we dedicate special events to her memory. That's a living legacy, and it shows that ACCA has always and will always promote the value of fairness and gender equality. That's not why it's no surprise women feel that they belong with us. And we have 24 of the 41 members are our global governing council, 59% are women. And 5 of my team, 7-strong executive team, are women. And that brings me to the first of my recommendations for how we get more women into boardrooms. As I mentioned at the start, it's about culture. It's about building a respect for gender equality, equality for all people into the DNA of business. It's about communicating these values clearly at every level of an organisation, and it's about living these values. That's the reason why my recommendations aren't about quotas or targets for numbers of women on boards. There's nothing wrong with those quotas. but quotas, if they can be granted, can also be removed. For a stronger and far more durable solution is my belief that every business benefits from more women's voices in the boardroom. After all, you can read as many reports about the benefits of quality as you like, but there's no substitute for lived experience and in gaining that insight and knowledge when investment decisions are made and strategic courses are set. I also believe mentoring is incredibly important. The leaders of today can make a major contribution by offering guidance and support to the female leaders of tomorrow. And the more that great female leaders emerge, the broader the path will be for talented young women to follow. ACCA's theme for last International Women's Day was Imposter Syndrome. It was about that inner voice which some women hear, which tells them they aren't ready or good enough to take on a bigger leadership role. I hope you'll excuse the generalisation, but men are still more likely to take a chance on applying for a promotion. More women are far more likely to focus on what they can't do rather than what they can do, and are less likely to take a leap of faith and apply. Our message is all about encouraging women that they should silence that voice that tells them they can't and listen to the voice that says you can. Mentors can play such an important role in amplifying the positive and drowning out the negative. One of the most important lessons a female leader can learn is that a career isn't something that happens to you, it's something you can make for yourself. One of the biggest challenges facing us to bridge the final step that separates senior women in non-board position from a director's role, even in countries where women are incredibly well educated and equipped with first-class degrees, double masters and PhDs, they get so far up the corporate ladder only to find the final rung missing. For me, the key to making that last move comes back to culture again. Businesses must come to understand that there is a clear business case why appointing more women to the board isn't a nice to have. It isn't a shiny statistic to adorn a glossy annual report or a crowd-pleasing PR stunt. It's a business essential, a necessity for any organisation that wants to build a sustainable future and reflect its customers, shareholders, and employees' lives and aspiration. I think it's this breakthrough in culture and in attitudes that will change women's prospects of reaching the boardroom. I believe that the landscape will surely change at last for the coming generation. And it will change because businesses simply cannot afford to ignore the talents of half the world's population if they want to survive. Yes, quota for women on boards can be useful. They can shine a spotlight on the urgent need for more women in senior roles. But this isn't all a numbers game. Even the most stringent target, robustly monitored and zealously enforced target, is not as powerful as the mightiest force there is, the unstoppable power of an idea whose time has come. Thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the sessions ahead.
Helen, thank you. Thank you very much for that very inspiring introduction and speech there. I loved this idea of an irresistible surge of women, and that finance will lead the way. But I think, you know, we're seeing in many parts of the world that those hopeful messages are still feel like a long way away. I haven't seen any questions yet on the Q&A, but I'm sure there will be some. But maybe just one from me, and that is this whole question of culture. How do we get that message into the boardroom, I guess, because that's surely where the message needs to be heard. And I think that a lot of businesses are still focusing on, you know, what they see as the business matters, and they don't see the relevance of diversity, sadly. Do you have any insight?
Yeah. Well, of course, we all know culture is a many-faceted thing, and I always wish there was a switch I could flick to get the right culture, but we know it takes a lot of time, a lot of work. I do think that the broader demands for society on business and government at the moment are a big opportunity to be bringing this message into the boardroom. And interestingly, investors will be one of the ways that happens. You know, we're seeing more and more the acute awareness of investors of that broader sense of performance that isn't purely financial. And they are looking at inclusion and diversity in the boardroom as one of the indicators of the health of a business and the likely future success of the business. I'm involved, as was mentioned, in the integrated reporting movement, and looking at that holistic use of capital. So, of course, sustainability in the climate change sense and broader sustainability is also part of that changing reporting landscape. But the social impact of a business is extremely important to investors now, and that gender diversity piece is important. So I think having that discussion around the boardroom table is becoming increasingly important. And one of the I guess frameworks I would suggest that can be used for that discussion and actually helps to drive business performance in that broader way are the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think, again, we're seeing more and more companies, declaring commitments to those goals, but B, having to demonstrate progress against them, so to measure their progress. So again, I think transparency, an understanding of how a business is going to move towards contributing to the achievement of those goals will be another avenue by which the value of women will be absolutely appreciated. But we have to make sure that conversation is taking place.
Thank you, Helen. There's a question here from Penelope saying, how do you fast track change? Because we heard from Sheila 135 years, I think the World Economic Forum even said 200 years. So, you know, my daughter, her children may not see that change. How do you fast track change if you don't do quotas? I think that's
yeah, well, I do think, as I said, I don't think quotas are necessarily a bad thing. I just think it's as a sustainable long-term tool, that's not enough in and of itself. So I think it's all about looking at the circumstances you're in, either as a business or as a country or as a region, and say, is that going to make a significant shift? And in many cases it will, but it needs to be underpinned by that cultural shift also, because political whims change, rules can be changed, but actually it's much harder, as we know, because we're trying to shift the culture in the positive way. If we can shift the culture in the positive way, it'll be harder to undo that. So I think we have seen example, and what I felt was interesting in the UK example was that there wasn't a mandatory quota, but there was a declared intent, and that then comes around to reputational damage or enhancement, doesn't it? And there was no business in the UK that wanted to be held up as the one organisation or business that hadn't moved towards the target that had been declared by the government, although it wasn't a mandatory target. So there are different ways of tackling this, but having a clear idea of what good looks like and saying that's what we're going to go for, and then being measured against it and being transparent about it, works in all of those contexts.
Thank you. There's a question here from Karen saying finance will lead the way, but do you automatically need finance to get a seat at the board? Is it an absolute prerequisite, or are there other qualities?
No, I mean, it's not an absolute prerequisite in terms of being professionally qualified. Absolutely not. And the many fantastic female leaders on boards who come from different executive routes. The one thing I would say, we did do a piece of research, it's a little bit old now, like about 6 years ago, which showed that of the women who did get onto boards, a far higher proportion of them had a finance qualification than the men. So the men were not being held to the same professional requirements as the women in order to get onto the board. So we did see that women on boards had there were a high number of them with finance qualifications. I certainly think that there's something of a false divide in the roles for women in executive teams and the roles for men in executive teams, and that's where we have to get that breadth and depth established. And I did mention executives a lot in my introduction, because I think unless we do tackle that, there isn't going to be the pipeline that does come onto the board. But essentially, yes, what that research showed was a high percentage of women had finance qualifications, and it was required more of them than it was required of men. So it was almost as if they were having to prove their seriousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Helen, one more question, I think, because we'll keep the other questions also for the panel discussions, I'm sure. But Joy Marie is saying, how do we really get over this patriarchy bias? Which is, you've almost mentioned it there as well, this idea that women have to be more qualified than men in a way to get into the boardroom. But the patriarchy bias, which requires deliberate intentions by the board. In your experience, any suggestions on overcoming this and the arguments to go with it?
Well, certainly there are lots of business, as I said, lots of evidence, which I think we all have to absorb and be able to talk about in terms of performance of a business being better with female board members and executive leaders. So, all of that. But I do think there's a long way to go in there being an acceptance of what a good leader looks like, that it's not one stereotypical, as you said, patriarchal role. And I think I'd say myself and women are as guilty of this as anyone else, that that's kind of assertive, very assertive, macho way of leading is understood to be how leadership happens. Now, we know that that is absolutely being blown out of the water at the moment. Generation Z, as I was talking about earlier, think it's laughable. I think they just don't get it at all. But we have to start modelling that more and more. The fantastic women that are on this call and the men who are here supporting, all those women and men here are really great role models that we have to get in front of people more to understand that leadership comes in many forms, and it can be very inclusive, it can be very different, and that's not, there isn't one way of being a female leader either, but we have to accept, if we're going to accept diversity, we have to accept and model diversity in leadership roles.
Helen, thank you very much. I'm going to stop there because we've got a panel of speakers. I hope you can stay with us for the panel, but we understand if you've got a dash, I know. But I'm going to hand over to Palmy now. But Helen, I think you'll see all the comments. Thank you for your brilliant thoughts. I think you've been very inspirational for a lot of people as well, not just on today's webinar, but in general. And thank you very much for joining us today and for getting us off to a great start and a very reflective but optimistic view, I think, that you've given us today, which is great. So, Palmy, I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce the panel. And there's lots of questions I can see queuing up, so I'll try and help you with those.
Thanks, Jane, and hello everybody from sunny Johannesburg, South Africa. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for our panel, a dear friend, colleague and mentor, Faye Mukadam. Along with being a Chartered Director SA and an advocate of the High Court in South Africa, Faye brings extensive leadership experience in various executive and non-executive roles and positions that she's occupied over the years. Faye was recognized as being the most influential businesswoman in the financial sector in South Africa in both 2016 and 2017, and has also been recognized through various other awards nationally and internationally. Through her thought leadership with the IODSA as technical advisor and subject matter expert, she has advised and assessed boards in the private and public sectors on key business and governance issues through their respective different business phases, and also acts as a mentor to individual directors. Faye is also a guest lecturer at major universities and business schools in South Africa, and has delivered papers at national and international conferences on governance, leadership, and development economics. She's a skilled public speaker, panelist, sought after opinionist on matters pertaining to leadership, governance, and the role of directors in the time of disruption. With that, I'll hand over to you, Faye.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Pami. And I'll just echo your earlier sentiments. Hello to everybody, wherever you are in the world. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I'm actually in a different part of South Africa, but also quite sunny today. So very lovely. Just to get into it, we are honored and privileged to have a very esteemed panel in the next session. And I can count one of the individuals there too as a friend, a dear friend and a colleague, spanning a period of well over a decade. More importantly for me, though, in addition to being an esteemed and seasoned panel, is that every single member on the panel has practical experience on the ground. And I think the value in that practical experience will come through in some of the discussions that we have. So just to introduce our panel this morning, I'm going to start off with Johnpierre Dallet. Johnpierre, correct me if I am getting any of the pronunciations incorrect. Johnpierre is the Group Chief Executive of Ciel Limited. Ciel is an international Mauritian group listed on the Stock Exchange of Mauritius and on the SEM Sustainability Index. The group invests and operates in 6 strategic sectors, namely agriculture, finance, healthcare, hotels and resorts, property and textile. Founded in 1912, Ciel is today present in more than 10 emerging markets across Africa and Asia, employing 32,000 talented individuals for a consolidated audited turnover of MUR 21.92 billion. Johnpierre has an MBA from the International University of America in San Francisco and is also the Vice President of the Business Mauritius Council. He also holds other directorships on several companies which are also listed on the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. I'm then going to move to our second panel member, Alaa Al-Hashem. Alaa is a licensed business advisor and full-time board member based out of Riyadh. He's a director in a variety of boards and committees of companies that are either publicly listed, government-owned, or family offices covering multiple industries. Alaa has worked in corporate and private banking and investment advisory for about 18 years, and then for the past 4 years, he has focused on directorships. He is skilled in portfolio management and optimization and keen on driving companies' performance through good governance and dynamic relationships with the executive teams. Alaa hopes to make a positive contribution in areas of special interest to him, such as diversity and inclusion, social investment, sustainability in family-owned businesses, literature, and visual arts. Alaa has a bachelor degree in accounting from King Fahd University, an MBA from Lancaster University. He's a chartered director and most notably the first Saudi national to be admitted as a fellow of the Institute of Directors in London. Our third panelist, Colleen Larson, is the president of the 30% Club of Southern and Eastern Africa. Colleen is the chief executive of Business Engage and has a career spanning 28 years within the financial services market. She is best known for her work in gender mainstreaming, having won recognition as one of the leading voices for the sustainable advancement of women in the corporate and entrepreneurial space in South Africa today, using the business case as a basis for transformation. She is the first chairperson of the South African Women Entrepreneurs Network, an initiative of the Department of Trade and Industry. And in 2013, she started the Gender Mainstreaming Awards, currently in its 9th year. Thank you, and I'm sure that you'll join me in welcoming all of these very experienced and senior individuals. I'm going to kick off, if I might, Johnpierre, just with some initial thoughts of yours, please.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I would say that from what I've heard today, the Helen presentation was extremely interesting. And I think what is really important is for us to set goals. If I take my example, I mean, we did approach our SDGs last year, and as far as gender balance, we did set some clear targets, which still are actually 30% at board level by 2030 and 35% at management, senior management level by 2025. And I must say that, I mean, I always inside of me had this will of introducing more women. But once you have, clear targets, it really motivates you and in fact opens up your mind, because you start working towards the target. And I must say that since I've been, working at it with a team which is doing a fantastic job, and we have a lady who is heading the Women Network Forum for the group, and this has actually percolated down to each other company of our group, which is quite large as a whole in terms of employees, because we employ in excess of 30,000 people, and we have 45% of our people who are women. So doing that has really helped us open up our mind and make us much more conscious about what needs to be done about it, and how we should really progress, and what are the different action points that we should trigger. So we set up a number of things, the programs, panel discussions, raising leadership training for women, and it had all started with I must say great enthusiasm, and I'm happy about the way things are progressing. But I realize how big and how daunting the challenge is, although this percentage may appear low to some of you, but we're still at 18% at our level as far as the board membership is concerned, and we have a number of companies, so we have a number of boards, so a lot to work on. What I would say is that as I move on, as I chair companies and being the CEO of a group, the lack of precise data is really a disadvantage, especially in a small country like ours. Mauritius, doesn't have that many professionals, although it's changing fast. And we tend to see that women are more people, or maybe in our country it's different. I mean, I heard what Helen said, it's changing, but the jobs that women take are more people-centric. And so it's more difficult to find people in finance. And right now I'm trying to find someone who can chair the audit and risk committee of quite a large, for our side, for our country, hotel company, but it's difficult to find people, who have that background. So that's a challenge. And then maybe a thought would be that we tend to focus a lot on experience. So maybe there should be more focus, on the competences to really make a change, and more focus on younger people, so that they can bring also, with the way we are marketing, our companies today, a different perspective to things. And then, okay, so I'll stop here. And
of course, there's a lot to get through. Okay. I think, Johnpierre, the 2 points just to pick out from what you're saying, I think is important. The fact that there should be clear goals and targets set. But I think of particular importance, and I'd like to come back to you after we hear from Allah as well, is that it's really important that the person who sits in a position of influence and authority actually throws their considerable weight behind these initiatives, failing which we won't actually see the needle moving. So I think that's of particular importance. Allah, just to bring you in here, obviously based on your introduction and your engagement on different boards in different spaces, as well as with management teams, what's your experience been like with the introduction or absence of support for women on boards?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Faye was very generous in the introduction, and usually when you write a bio, you don't feel that that it's exaggerated, but when it is recited out loud, I felt a bit embarrassed, because that gave me a little bit sense of inflated maybe accomplishments. But to be very honest, I when I was asked to speak, I didn't know what to say because I might not be that influential person, as Faye mentioned, but I'm trying my best. So I decided to dedicate my part today speaking about what are the practical things as us as individuals can do to help the cause. Because in webinars and seminars and conferences, there is a lot of talk, but it's very hard to take these takeaways and apply them in business. So I'll try to focus on the practical way of each of us, what can do as male and female to get in the boardroom, and after we get in the boardroom, what to do. So when you take a round again and you come back to me, I think I'll focus.
All right. Would you just to pick up on that again, there's something that's particularly interesting for me, is the lack of data that Johnpierre alluded to. Colleen, what's you're right there on the ground, and I think have the war wounds, which I'm familiar with, to share with us. What's your experience been in terms of whether it be absence of data and maybe some more practical experiences that some of the women who have engaged with you have shared, and maybe just a little bit about some of the companies as well that have been awarded the Gender Mainstreaming Awards, or maybe not been, fortunate enough. Just some of those issues, please. Thank you.
Fantastic, Faye. So thanks so much for having me. And I'm looking at my screen, and apologies, I see I'm back to front for my background, but I thought I understood exactly what to do. So apologies for that. But I think, Faye, one of the things we have to bear in mind is that this is not a story that's going to happen overnight. We're on a journey, and I think, but we're going in the right direction. So I think if we're going to think it's going to happen by tomorrow, I've coined a word called a clevolution, because we don't want it to be a revolution, because that's really not sustainable. We also don't want to wait the 135 years that it tells us we're going to take to get to parity. So it's got to be somewhere between that. But I think, we've got to understand that with boards, we need consistency, and only then will change takes place. So I think what we've done is, as a collective, is we've really driven this whole conversation around women's issues, women's problems with women, that type of thing. And yet it's the diversity that makes a business sense, and it's diversity that makes business sense to take us forward into where we want to go to. Having said that, I think where we really get stuck is we drive it from a numbers game. So we set those targets and we drive towards the targets, but we don't look after the culture. And so what happens is we get the numbers right, and at the end of the year, we're then chasing numbers again because we haven't dealt with the culture. So I think there's a lot more broader aspects around this. Business Engage has been tracking all of the JSE listed companies over the last 4 years, because we strongly believe that either legislation or regulation is what actually drives us forward. Even when we had the King Codes, when they were recommending that we rotate at least a third of the non-executive directors once a year, we saw 0 rotation. So I'm not an advocate for quotas, because I believe that you get to the quota and you stop. However, pushing us in that direction and getting us on the go is something that we really need. When we started what we were doing, we were strong advocates of making sure that the chairman, CEO, and board get involved in what we're doing, because you've got to have the DNA of the organization. To really drive this. You can't drive it as a numbers game. It just doesn't make sense. But in order to move the conversation forward, we need to have a much broader conversation, not only in terms of the numbers, because I think we get stuck on the numbers and then we talk about what hasn't been achieved, what we haven't done, instead of saying, this is where we're going, this is what we're going to do, and tell the stories. That is where the Gender Mainstreaming Award started, was because everybody's doing things, but it's all been done in their little silos and no stories. So it looks like gender's this little program that nobody's doing. And when you put it all together, so much has been done. And so I think even in terms of research, we haven't coordinated all the research. There's a lot of research that's been done, but we haven't coordinated. And we haven't actually got that into a more powerful group of information that we can use. So yes, things are happening. Yes, we haven't achieved what we should have done by now. But the thing is, we can't look at what we haven't done. We have to look at where we're going to and put that in the targets go forward.
Thank you, Carl. Ala, if I can just come back to you, you said that you might not be that influential. I think you certainly are. And of course, everybody is. And you can see from your experiences, why do you think that some boards are reluctant to actually appoint women? Why, in your experience, have you found that?
Well, Faye, that was actually the title of this panel, why boards are reluctant. And I was swimming against that current, sort of speak, because I don't think the boards are the only stakeholder or party that is involved in the decision making. There is a lot of components in the ecosystem. The board usually will have a nomination committee, and that nomination committee should have a direction or general direction of who to hire based on competencies. I think Johnpierre will elaborate on the competency aspect, but the nomination committee is usually working within guidelines. But if they don't have this engraved in their daily thinkings that they have to be fair and they have to give equal opportunities and they have to consider the larger pool of men and women. And I think all the panelists will agree that the women pool is smaller. So you can't find many executives. That was the case in Mauritius, as Jean-Paul said, and I think all other countries. But in the GCC countries, the problem might be magnified a little. So there aren't as many. So it makes the job of the NRC more difficult to try to find women candidates. But I'll give you an example, and I will lead to the observation I have. In one of the listed companies in Saudi Arabia, and that's the only arena where women will need to apply for the job instead of being headhunted. So the listed companies, usually they announce the vacancies on the Tadawul exchange, which is the index here in Saudi Arabia, or the stock exchange name. So they will have to go to the portal. The company will go to the portal and announce that the General Assembly will happen on that day and anyone can apply. The issue with that is that they don't specify that women and men can apply. They just say anyone who thinks is entitled, is qualified, can apply. And back to that example, I think the applications were 34 or 37. That particular case was few months back, and there was only one woman applicant. So I felt that women in general, they don't feel entitled to apply. First, because the pool is small and not a lot of people have worked on the mentality and the awareness of women in their middle career. And I think to solve the leadership pool problem, we should start working on the middle management pool, and anyone who is involved and anyone who cares about this subject should take lead in coaching and mentoring this middle management women to help them grow on the ladder of leadership, and then feel that they are qualified and entitled, and also has it as a career goal to be on board. Because as I speak with a lot of them, they don't see it as a career goal. They don't know how much they are being compensated for it, and they don't even see it as a natural progression after they become leaders for their organizations. So that's step number one in my practical list of what to do.
Thank you for that, Ala. Johnpierre, to come back to you, you had mentioned that sometimes it's difficult, for example, to find somebody with a more technical background, and there seems to be a default where women are put into the historically safer, maybe, positions and appointments. Just based on what Ala is saying also, as how women either see themselves and how they can be supported? What's your experience been? And maybe just to draw on some of the other boards that you sit on the SEM as well, is there a reluctance, or is there a grappling in terms of what Colleen said, just a focused, guided roadmap? This is where we're heading. Johnpierre, you're on mute.
I think that it is very important, first of all, that at board level, the chairman, because as we heard earlier, I mean, most of the chairman positions are actually taken by men. I think on the one hand, it's extremely important that the space is made, for the woman to express, because there is, a difference in approach. And I think we have to be careful as chairman as we manage boards. And then the other aspect is, I think that the way we run boards should actually be changed. I think that we look too much at the back mirrors. We focus too much on the financials. And as Helen said earlier, there are many other KPIs to look at, and then strategy, of course, is extremely important, but many other SDGs that we need to focus on are as important. So I think it is the responsibility of the board to change that approach and to make more space for women who can bring, I think, from that perspective, maybe, more rapid additional value. And then, of course, it's all about training. I think it's difficult to sit on a board if you don't fully grasp, the financial implications, because the way that, we are audited and the way that the finance profession is moving is still, demanding a lot of understanding of, what are the parameters behind the financial numbers, and especially so if you are in the banking industry, for instance.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Colleen, just to bring you in here, we've touched on, and unfortunately it's such a short time period for some rich debate, but there's the issues of historic patriarchy, of historic and traditional social norms and a view, not just maybe boards and companies grappling with how to increase female participation, but like Allah says, the women themselves being reluctant or not being able to see themselves in those positions. You touched earlier on that roadmap issue, and as opposed to, maliciously in a malicious compliance manner, chasing targets, but looking at programs and starting these earlier. And I'm sure you can draw on your history when we look at gender mainstreaming, for example. If you want women to participate, how do you deal with childcare in a programmatic sense? So are we making any progress, or are we just setting up these childcare programs and not really thinking through whether, if a woman really leaves early consistently, that somewhere, somehow, subconsciously she is being excluded from progression and promotion, things like that? What's your experience?
Yeah, so I think, sorry, I just need to move out of here quickly. Just give me a sec.
Not a problem. And whilst you're moving, I can tell you that my screen is the one that's upside down, I think, not yours.
Sorry, we've actually, it's Women's Month, so we've got a function happening. I've got another thing, so apologies. So look, I mean, I think that what has happened is that we've really looked at things very much in isolation rather than really a concerted, collaborative thing. So what happens is we come up with all of these recommendations, not really taking it from start to finish. So we come up with the childcare, but yet we haven't actually considered that if you look at the education of girls coming up, that is where one of the issues is, because we've got so many girls that are out of school. We haven't even spoken about that. We also women have been socialized, keep your head down, work hard, get your matric, get your degree, get your master's, get your PhD. And then what happens is then we don't actually have the talent, as Johnpierre said, with the finance, because we haven't considered what are the real issues. We're just trying to plug little things, little issues as we go along. So even when we speak to boards now, They are saying that they want more rounded board members. They want board members that can come into the board and not only talk on one particular topic, but when you actually start conversations, they can actually input their advice. So that is where women actually lack confidence, because what happens is a conversation goes off on finance, and perhaps they are marketing an individual and they haven't really had the necessary know-how. So I think before we start looking at putting in little bits and pieces, we should actually take a step back, look at all the issues, but look at if we actually address all of the issues, what are the things? And I think what we've also done is we've made it a male-female issue. So why do we talk about mothers with babies that they have to look after? If you look at the pandemic now, we actually are finding that fathers are turning around and saying, you know what, I'd love to spend a bit of time with my kids. You know, and it's then starting to take kids to school and whatnot. So I think we need to get away from this male-female conversation and realize that we are all people. And once you start understanding that we're all people with all skills, you can actually then start building a talent pipeline with diversity that makes that business sense. You know, and as I said, until we get away from this male-female issue and how men are more this and women are more that, I don't think we'll ever reach the point where we can truly say we got that diversity happening.
Thank you for that, Colleen. That stereotypical binary view, you know, that always ends up, the default is pigeonholing us. So I'm just going to turn to some of the questions from the delegates. And the first one, and I'll take thoughts from each of you if you'd like, or any one person. The question, though, is to the whole panel. When we look at ESG conversations, which is the current focus, I feel this seems to be increasingly the environment which is driven by expectations and demands of stakeholders, consumers, investors, etc. How can we get stakeholders to appreciate the importance of diversity equally or more? And Helen alluded to this in her introductory topic, and we're certainly seeing it on the ground, is that if investors are a lot more active in making certain demands or requesting certain information when it comes to board selection, nomination, appointment, then that does carry a lot of weight. What are your thoughts in terms of this? Johnpierre, I'll start with you.
Sorry, I've just been disturbed. Could you roll to someone else? I'll come back to you.
Not a problem. It is also, if you'd like, the questions are in the Q&A box. Ala, would you like to take a stab at just some thoughts?
Sure. It's a big question about the ESG.
It is.
Like,
it is.
I would like to use an analogy here. Somebody speaks to his boss and says, boss, we need to talk about ESG. And that boss would tell him, who's asking? Like who's pushing for it? And as you rightly mentioned, if the investor is not pushing for it, then there is a problem, because that boss is probably busy improving his bottom line, streamlining. So ESG is maybe at the back of his head, but it's not the priority today. And I was lucky enough to attend a 6-week conscious investor fellowship. It's called like that. And I wasn't aware why it's called conscious investor, because you will have to move from a stage of unconscious to conscious. But as an investor, probably you are not conscious today, and then you have to move to that stage. One of the governance pillars is for investors to participate in the governance setup in any organizations. And take again an example of a listed company. The small shareholders aren't participating enough in the governance and in the decision making. Probably they are attending once every 3 years the General Assembly and just listening. So if they are not moving from being unconscious investor to being conscious investor, they will not prioritize anything. The other party that I want to mention is the customer for any organization. So if I will buy your product, I want you to go by my values and ethics. ESG might be one of them. And if the customer also is unconscious of what his influence on that particular company by buying or not buying, also it requires that the whole society is aware and everyone in the society is participating. That's what's making it difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ala. Just to pick up, Colleen, in addition to that question, you know, and something you said earlier, Nigel is asking how do we get owners and leadership of organizations to appreciate that the diversity and the inclusion actually leads to profitability. And that falls squarely within this ESG basket now, which is the flavor of the month. And yet, like all good things, is as old as time itself. What are your thoughts, Cole?
Well, what I think is it's the conversations that we have been having. It's a result of investors and that not knowing about the impact that we can have by making diversity on the board. So, as I said, once again, we've made it a women's issue. I don't know of any man that sits in the morning and says, let's see how we get women down today. They're far too busy doing business. And I think that is where we need to get to. We need to get to a point is what does make business sense? Are we talking about the fact that it's men out, women in terms of a board? No, we're not, because essentially it's not about actually looking at how do we bring in more women who perhaps don't have the competence, as Johnpierre was speaking about. It really is about, once you've built the pipeline, once you've actually got the true steps in an initiative to, or in terms of your targets, whatever you set within a company, that actually speak to what your values are, what your culture is, what your targets are, what your bottom line is, all of those things. By the time it gets to the board, you've already sold the case. You cannot actually sell a case with just putting women in the top. It just doesn't work. And so I think the conversation is, and I did see one of the Q&A was talking about why do we only chase the listed boards. No, it's not only the listed boards, because it's not only the listed boards that actually have this conversation going, but until such time as we can really build a consistent and really thought out how we address the issues before we even get to the board, we will never see the results we're looking for. So yeah, I think it's a much bigger picture than that.
Okay, thank you. Johnpierre, to come back to you, not just the ESG debate, but also pulling on from some of the things that you raised earlier in terms of, like Colleen says, competency, but also a supported programmatic approach.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would like to pick up on what Colleen said. I think diversity is definitely a strength. I mean, we are in a country which is very much multicultural, and I think that's a huge strength which we are not exploiting enough. Many of Mauritian companies have invested abroad, and the fact that we have these different backgrounds, I think we are in a position to interrelate with different communities very well. So it is definitely a matter of diversity. I mean, women is part of the diversity, right? Because I think the decision-making process really is best when there is a diverse opinion. Otherwise, you tend to have people, thinking in the same direction and making the same wrong decision, hopefully the right one, but very often the wrong one. So we need that diversity is very important. And then on the, we really need to embrace sustainability and the ESG. I think today is not even a debate. I mean, the customers are moving flat out in that direction. And if we don't do that, we'll be left behind if it's not already the case. So that's really a complete must. And it's not even a company's must, but it's a country's must. And when I look at our beautiful little country, always think that we can do so much better in terms of sustainability at large. We've been very affected by the hotel industry. But yes, getting the right competences, I think we need to be more daring at the level of a board and the level of a management to take more risk, employ younger people who have a different mindset. and can bring competencies which are different. And very often we tend to stick to the same kind of thinking and not allow younger people to come in, and they are, so surprising, and they can, teach us so many things,
Sure.
even at board level.
I love that, Johnpierre. I do think we need to, fortune does favor the brave, and probably now's the time for bold, hairy and audacious goals and objectives, as you've said. Alas, some of the questions that are coming up talk about whether or not can men be doing some more? Should we put or increase the number of women on nomination committees, because then maybe women will be supported a lot more? Perhaps women are not seeing themselves as being on the boards because family comes first. So still very much this binary view that Carl also talked about. What's your experience been in terms of women? Is it that they're not being selected, or they're not being, or then insufficient number of them are actually applying?
See, there is a difference between organic and inorganic way of doing things and filling gaps. And what I understand from the talk today, last week, and all the other webinars I attended is that there is always an urge of filling the gap or closing the gap or doing something inorganically to fix a problem. And I'm not a big fan of this, as I see things should progress naturally. As mentioned earlier, we are all agreeing on that limited pool of talents that are available in certain progression of women career, which is leadership. And I don't have the stats today, so I cannot tell you there are as many women in executive leadership, but the observer will just know it, that there are limited number of women anyways. So if we try to force things, just like the legal quota system, things will get ugly because people will not feel comfortable. I think there are 4 things that as individuals we can do, and I listed them here. One of them is, as mentioned earlier, career coaching and mentoring, which is very important, and it should be done on a grassroots level. I think all these 6 institutes that you guys belong to, GCC, BDI being one of them, is working on mentorship program. So there is an official mentorship program, but we also work outside these borders, and we try to mentor as many women as possible and give them the sense of entitlement, and we tell them where to get the qualification to be on board, and also highlight that this is a good career option for you if you want to grow up the ladder. The second thing is, as you mentioned, forcing it through NRCs. The nomination committees would usually have a good say about it, but there should be a groundwork behind it. So not a lot of company can find women and men equally, qualified men and women, to put them on board. I personally head one nomination committee, and there are certain people who should help. Headhunting companies, your personal network, a friend who already worked on a project like this before and have access to the GCC, BDI can, and all, I think the institute can advertise for you if you want. But the tricky part is to be bold enough to say this position is open to women and men. So you give them the encouragement to apply, and also make a point for the rest of the board members is that I am giving a priority to women because this board doesn't have a woman. And you will have to tell them why diversity is good. And please don't go back to the research that's being done, because all the conferences talk about this research. Like, if you introduce women to the board, you get better. There is evidence for improved performance. And I don't see anyone listening in the company level for these statistics and research results, because they see what is available for them. And they also have to make board evaluation first to understand what is their baseline and what is the improvement they are getting with men. So when they introduce women, they will know the difference. So they don't want to hear the statistics of someone else or the research of someone else. They want to see it practically for them. The third thing we already covered, which is to act as an investor, as a conscious investor, to make a point when you join a general assembly or you are a venture capital company or a private equity company, is that a criteria for investing should be diversity. And I would say diversity in general. I wouldn't specify gender diversity or anything, because diversity as a quality on its own is the one we are seeking. And it will produce the improved performance that we are hoping for, and also will reduce the sensitivity to the topic. So we ask for diversity, we don't say gender diversity. And the last thing, you can act in a good way to change the policies of the country. I think the legislation in any country will play a great role, but you can change it or influence it in two ways. You can either be the policymaker, work for the Capital Market Authority, work for the court, for the Royal Court, work for the Dawel, one of these agencies that influence things on the legislation side. But you also can be an advocate for it. So you can lobby for it, you can speak with those who make decisions, you can be an organization that specializes in advocacy, you can be the Institute of Directors in certain country and advocate for. So there are 4 things mainly to do, and I've just summarized them now.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move towards the closing part of the panel, and maybe as part of your closing remarks from each of the 3 of you, I'm going to pick up on Gemma's question, which is that just from within the governance space, and where women might in the governance space be feeling a lot more heightened sense of imposter syndrome, and intimidating governance culture, being faced on a daily basis by the patriarchal systems. Do you think that we need to consider a governance a paradigm shift in this space, and revisiting the culture and the processes within organizations to look at attracting additional women? And you know, there's a cartoon that I'm sure some people have seen. It's usually applied to race, certainly in South Africa, but also to gender, where whilst you're allowed to start equally, if historically you have been prejudiced for whatever the reason, then your path ahead might be strewn with obstacles. So the race is not completely equitable, and we're not maybe together on a parity. So maybe that's what Gemma's alluding to. Do we need to do anything? And if I can then just have your closing sentiments as well. Cole, I'm going to start first with you, please. Thank you.
Look, I mean, I think, yes, I get you. I get you that there's imposter syndrome. I get all of that. And I mean, we've spoken about the issues forever and a day. But I think where we really have to get to is the point where we know the past, we know what has happened, we know all of these issues. I think especially the women who have actually experienced things like imposter syndrome and that type of thing as they've gone forward and they've overcome these things, I think it's bigger onus on them to actually come back and train up the people that are coming on behind. But until such time as, you know, there are various other aspects, and as I said, you know, these things like, for instance, there are women available. When we speak to corporates and they say, oh, where are these women? We just don't know where they are. The problem is that women, because of the journey they've been on, they don't shout about their achievements. They don't talk about who they are and what they've achieved. So by the time they get to their board structure, nobody really knows how powerful they are. And then they step into that board environment and they're such powerful women and mothers and everything like that. And they step into that board environment and their mouth is closed. Because now they're scared. For some reason, that board's got and senior leadership has got like a thing on. And I think what we need to do is take a step back, make women understand how really powerful they are, make them understand that unless they're there, that one cog of the diversity is not actually being addressed. And that is where we need to get to. Not about going to boards and knocking on them and saying what you haven't done, who you haven't done. Because I'll turn around and say, you know what, we've got more than enough on our plate, go and talk to somebody else. So what we have to do is we have to take a step back, put in place our journey of what we want to achieve, and go and make it happen. And that is together with men walking along, because what we're very good at is women talking to women about women's issues, rather than bring women and men together to make it happen.
A very, very powerful closing statement there, and heartily agreed, Carl. Thank you. Thank you. Your passion is always so refreshing. Johnpierre?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Colleen, and I think it's two different things: setting up targets that you want to achieve, and on the other hand, forcing some kind of parity or balance at board level. I've witnessed, I mean, over the last 10 years or so, speaking to French chairmen or CEOs, and very often I heard the phrase, well, she's on the board because we have to respect that quota. I think there's nothing worse than that. But giving ourselves targets doesn't forbid us from making absolutely sure that the talent is there and the quality is there. This is, of course, the priority, and we won't budge on that. So I think there's a different approach. And what I believe can really change, I mean, of course, we talked about many actions that can really make women at large progress and reach higher level within the organization. But I think we need to talk to the men, and we need to talk to the boards. We need to talk to the chairmen. We need to talk to the nomination chairmen, of these committees, and really get them trained. And open up. It's all about communication, opening up the mind, thinking differently from the past, and making people realize that if we think like the past, then we're going to fail.
Thank you. Thank you, Johnpierre. Ala, closing comments from you, please.
Well, I attended the first session last week, and I wrote something on the chat. So I made a kind of a promise that we will cover something next week. And today I need to fulfill that promise. Some of the panelists last week talked about when you join as a woman, when you join a board, you have to make yourself heard. You have to speak out and show that you can contribute. And I felt a little bit taken by this point, and I wanted to comment on it because I see it differently. I see that women, when they join, they should be not one of the boys. I wouldn't say exactly like that, but they should act like one of the 7 or 8 or 10 board members, act wisely and act based on their competencies, not because of the fact they are women. Because if she always remind everyone else that because I'm a woman, I can speak freely about women. I can speak about my species. I will tell you how women think. Because as a man, I have a wife, mother, daughters, sisters, and I know also how women think and what's their preferences. So you can't just tell me, ignore what you know about women and just listen to me because I'm the woman in the room. And I want them to please consider another approach, which is to just play along, understand the dynamics of the board they are in. Because as we all cover this topic, we will try to lead more women into the boardroom, but then in the boardroom, they have to make themselves accepted, contributing and adding value as a collective body. Because in governance, they teach us about a collective body and you have to contribute as a whole. And then, unfortunately, sometimes they ruin this picture. When they join, they act as a single person and wants to be heard out. I think they should sometimes make a point that this is my personal opinion and I will be very strong and will advocate for it and fight. But for the rest of the times where she can just act gracefully as member of the board. And remember, if the board is 11 people, you are 1 over 11. So I wouldn't say that you are not very special, but you're just one of the other people that you need to respect everyone else. That's my closing.
Thank you very much for that, Ala. A point very well made. On that note, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our panel members. We've been very fortunate, all the delegates, to have engaged such a diverse panel, which is representative and reflective of so many different experiences, areas of expertise, and thoughts and perspectives as well. To each of you, I'd like to personally say thank you for sharing with authenticity, with passion, and obviously a deep commitment, and your contribution is seen and appreciated. In Africa, we have a proverb that is often attributed to Madiba, that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think not just this panel, but this series is really practical evidence of that. And I think we should all be proud. Thank you so much. Dan, do I hand back to you?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to Helen, Faye, Ala, Colleen, Jean-Pierre for making our first session so successful and for sharing your insights so freely. I think that was really great. And also, I'm really encouraged by the engagement and questions from our audience. If I can just remind everybody that there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen for comments and chats amongst each other. But if you have questions, if I can please preferably ask you to put it in the Q&A box, because that's more what the moderators are monitoring in terms of answering questions. But keep the questions coming. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible. So with that, we're going to move on to session 2. And our keynote speaker for session 2, I'm going to introduce now. And I'm looking forward to hearing another male's perspective in this conversation. So Mr. Mutlaq Al-Morshed is the Chief Executive Officer of Tasnee, one of the largest Saudi diversified industrial companies having investments in several fields. Prior to his present post, he was the Executive Vice President of Corporate Finance at SABIC, the Vice President of Metals SPU, EVP Shared Services, the President of SADAF and Hadid consecutively. He was also the Chairman of the Board of Yansab SABIC Capital in the Netherlands, Saudi Kayan SABIC Captive Insurance Limited in the UK, and Elimna Investments Co., amongst many, many other boards which take up quite a bit of this bio. Mr. Morshed holds an MBA degree from Stanford University, a Master of Science degree in Nuclear Engineering from Princeton University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Nuclear Physics and Mathematics from the University of Denver. So with that, we are very eager to hear your words, and I hand over to you, Mutlaq.
Thank you, Pami. Good morning, everybody. It's quite early for me personally here in New York City. It's 4:30 in the morning. I joined the first session already. It's very interesting. And basically what I would like to say is almost in line what's been said in the first panel. But really, I think having women in the board is really overdue. We should have done it much earlier. Unfortunately, in certain countries has its own certain specifics, situation, cultural, and what have you. And especially where we are in the Middle East and the GCC countries, it's not, frankly, that easy. It's a very male-dominated society, and getting to boards is not that easy, to be honest, no matter what you call it, unless your dad is a rich man and who puts you on the board. That's a different story. But it's slowly changing. Personally, I would differ with some of the opinion that was stated earlier. I think there is some need for regulation. I was the chairman of SABIC Capital in Amsterdam, and back in 2012 or 13, if my memory serves me right, the Dutch government actually made a ruling that 30% of boards have to be women. And so in SABIC Capital, we have to quickly get some ladies on the board from SABIC employees in America. And so even in Holland, where we all know it's quite progressive and equal and all that, it took rules of the capital market or the government or whatever authorities to enforce that. I am personally not a pro of quotas and regulations by government or regulatory bodies, but unfortunately there are certain things like a nuclear reaction, which was my background, that it's a great reaction, but it will never start by itself. you need some igniter. You need to ignite it. You need to initiate it. Once it's initiated, it will last basically forever, as long as you have enough fuel and atoms to do the reaction. So I think that's in the beginning, we need some sort of regulations by capital market authorities, let it by 30, 20, whatever it is. And then after a while, you can drop that. Once it goes and up and running, I think it's not an issue. You can maintain it. But unfortunately, in the beginning, we need some sort of a push. Because it won't easily happen. We can talk about women getting ready, educated, and they are, let's face it. I know in Saudi, some of our employees in the company are actually better educated than the boys, and more competent and even more disciplined and everything. But unless some sort of a push comes in, it will be difficult, really, to get there in the boardroom and the C-suite. And it takes that kind of things. At the same time, I also agree, once ladies, women on the board, also they should not take it for granted and say, I have to take the airtime, and because I'm a woman, I should do that. There's no, at the end of the day, we're all equal, men or women, there's nobody different than anybody. There are all the, the one who knows better than others, and that's just nature. And that's something we should enforce. That's something in any board. There should be some push for inclusion of diversity, not only the female side, but even different culture, different things, especially when you run a global company like we do. You need different people, in New York City, we have a board meeting and we have 2 women on the board, and it's in America. And imagine, only 2 out of 10, that's 20%. So, and there is no rules here, of course, but it's kind of expected. So I think in countries like our part of the world, where it's a little bit, women are disadvantaged, let's call it, in a male-dominated society, traditional society, there have to be some kind of a push, and that's needed. And I think with time, this will happen eventually, and it has to be encouraged and done. At the board level, I think some enlightened boards are already doing that, but not necessarily all. If you look at some of the boards I know of in the whole GCC, maybe Bahrain is a little bit ahead. UAE has some regulation doing some of that. Saudi doesn't, which is the largest country in the region. So there is more of a need for some sort of push in our part of the world. And I think once it's done, it will take care of itself. And we should push that. And I am a believer that having women in the board will add an advantage to the board itself and the business by bringing a different point of view, more of analytical, more of a compassionate, more of an emotion side, because let's face it, most of us men tend to be a little bit hard, a little bit more of the scientific, people like me, physics and math and engineering and finance, it's kind of very dry subjects. And so we need that perspective on the other side. And I am sure by including the female part of the society, which is another thing, it's a 50% of the population, we like it or not, that will add, a big benefit to the business and opens new avenues. And it's really overdue. We should be doing that a long time ago. We shouldn't be even needing a meeting like this to promote this. It should happen naturally, because nature is, men, women are more or less 50-50. But unfortunately, in different societies, different things. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, for example, which is quite progressive, you find they have even a law there. In Norway and I think Denmark, they're requiring at least 30%. So there is some sort of a push for that. And I think it will happen naturally. Of course it will happen, but it will be much slower. It will take longer without regulation. It's like when you look at corporate governance, transparency, and all that. Companies, let's face it, will do the minimum as much as they can because it costs them money, effort, and things. But when it puts in regulation, and the regulator requires that, let it be CMA or central bank or whatever it is, then companies will respond and they will find a way to meet the rules and regulation of the law. And so it's same thing with having the females part on the boards. You need that kind of a push. And eventually, of course, you don't need to keep that law or regulation in place. It can be changed. But as board goes, as NRC committees, it would be really nice to include. But I can tell you, I've been in boards globally, around the world. I can tell you the subject, frankly, doesn't come very often. We can massage it, we can BS it, we can do what we want. The bottom line, it really doesn't come naturally. It's what you call it, the old boys club or whatever it is. I don't think it's intentionally, to be honest with you, but just the way it is. Guys, older guys like me or whoever been on boards and others just don't think of that. They just think of chief results. What's your quarterly result? What's your safety? What's your this? Boom, boom, boom. And how much dividend you're going to give and so on. So unless there is something from the outside to push that kind of things, it's actually very hard to happen naturally, because by nature, business is concentrating on results, and mostly it's financial results, because that's what the market wants and that's what the shareholders require. And up to now, shareholders are not saying how many women you have on your board. Maybe some do, but the reality of the matter, they're looking how much dividend you're given. What's your EBITDA? What's your net profit? And so on. That's really what drives the business. And so that's what I see the things for it. So I'm not going to talk too much. I'm just going to throw in my 2 cents in the basket and stop here and take questions later, and wish you a great meeting. Unfortunately, we could not make it in person, so we have to do it remotely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can start us off on Q&A with 2 things that I've picked up. One of them is actually coming from the previous session that I wanted to bring through to you that I picked up. There was one question that said, are men doing enough to add their voice to this conversation and help fix this problem that we have? And then there was another comment that sort of said, even men who buy into this idea perhaps don't know what they should be doing. So I'm interested in your perspective on, do you think men are doing enough? And if not, do you have some tips on what types of things they could be doing to help with this?
Well, frankly, I always known to speak my mind. I don't think so. I don't think men doing enough. And I don't think they do it on purpose either. I think just in a board meeting, there is so many things happening, and the focus basically on, the health of the business, the safety, or whatever industry you are in. And, they just don't think of that. They're thinking of what's going to happen tomorrow when the announcement comes. How is the market going to react? Is my share price going to go up? Is my share price goes down? Unless you affect that kind of mentality of my share price, my profit, my this, men by nature, I'm not saying men, it can be anybody, frankly, who's in a board. Board priorities is shareholders, benefit. And shareholders basically is capital appreciation. I mean, share price going up and dividend. And therefore, the board dynamics or the board, I've been in boards all over the world, and I can tell you there is no difference, honestly, around the world, because the board meets 4 or 5 times a year. Meets you know, in America, we meet longer, 1 or 2 days. In Middle East, unfortunately, you meet 2 hours and everybody in a rush to leave. I have a flight to catch and so on and so on. So how much discussion are you gonna have? Not a heck of a lot, to be honest. And therefore, you know, men do, but I would not blame it on men or women. It's not a gender issue. It's just the way it is, and it happens hundreds of years, whatever it is. And priorities of boards tends to be shareholders and stock market and dividend and so on. So the subject, frankly, doesn't come naturally because their priorities are different. And therefore, that's what my argument is, you need some sort of ignition. You need to ignite it by some sort of regulation. That's really my point, honestly. What was the second question?
Thank you. So my second question is, it's touching on something that you've already talked about, which is the cultural differences. And you mentioned, you know, different countries and cultures having different sort of approaches to men and women in society. So in my mind, I'm just thinking, if we shift this corporate culture towards men and women are equal, do we need to be doing more to shift societal culture as well? Because you'll often find you'll have in the workplace a powerful woman leader, but back in a home society, when she goes home, she needs to be subservient to a male, for example. So I'm just interested in that paradox in your region.
Yeah, but really not necessarily, to be honest. I think some women acting like men is counterproductive. A woman is a woman, a man is a man. You know, you can't really be a man when you're a woman, technically, by biology. And therefore, men at board will actually find it too much a turn off if somebody on the board acted too much like them, because they respect who you are. I mean, they don't have to, you don't have to prove yourself. You're as, you know, as good as the men. There are women who are 100 times better than men. Let's face it. And therefore, I think the most is to be yourself and add your own perspective, your own point of view to the discussion or to the board meeting. I have in Bahrain, where I'm on the board of ALBA, we have 2 ladies out of 10, and here in Tronox in New York City, also 2 out of 10, and I must say they do represent what I would say a great woman on the board. Not proving they are equal to men in any sense. They are not inferior either, but you don't have to go out of your way to show you're like that. You just act like a board member. That's it. Doesn't matter, man or woman. And I think overdoing it tends to, frankly, backfire and give women actually a bad name on boards. And people say, oh, look at this board with this woman, blah, 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 blah. And unfortunately, some men use that to justify not having women in their boards. So you shouldn't fall in that trap. That's really not so healthy. So it's better just to be yourself, and that's it.
So there's a question from Joy Marie, and I think it's linked to, you know, the statement around shareholders wanting financial returns or dividends, right? So that their focus is on financial progress. So she's saying, you know, how do we raise the consciousness of the board by almost putting it in financial terms? So what would the impact on return on investment be if there were more diverse boards? Do you think, you know, if there were better decision-making, etc., perhaps the financial performance would be better? So is there more we should be doing around amplifying that message?
I fully agree. I think there is some studies, there is some statistic, although it's not a lot, showing actually with women on board, actually there is a better share price, a better return, because women add some more of the emotion, more analytical side to the discussion at the board level, and more of a better decision at the board level. There's no question. Unfortunately, that's still small and not widely known in the general business community. It's not something people said, oh, company A has women, therefore their performance is better. That's not there yet. But absolutely, there is a lot of indicator and some studies that actually shows that. But if you wait, it will take time for this to happen. Remember, these boards and these businesses, they've been there hundreds of years, and we human beings, let's face it, we don't change very easily. We all talk about change, but change on you. When it comes to me, I like the way I am. So, so it will not happen so easily, to be honest with you. And I think the more women on board definitely is better. And some of us who studied and read and some of these know that, but that's a minority. That's extremely a small group, extremely. So it needs to be more publicized. And I think it's, again, back to some rules and governments, regulation. Do you think companies will be transparent and publishing financial results if the regulator didn't say so? They will not. I can assure you that. I've been a CEO for many years and CFO for many years. And I can tell you, they find it a hassle. And we human beings by nature don't like to do something that's a hassle. And therefore, they will not. And therefore we do all these things, which are right, don't get me wrong, but because there's requirement to do so. And therefore, that's what we need to do. I mean, that's really honestly the point. I'm trying to be very blunt here, so I hope I don't upset anybody.
Thank you so much. So there's another question from Ehsan, and I think it's linked to this whole conversation around quotas. Because very few countries in the world have legal quotas for women on boards. And if certain countries are far away from being able to get there, Ehsan is saying in emerging markets, would making certain legislation for certain industries or sectors, for example, fashion or education, at least be a start to us having more women inclusion on boards and in the C-suite. What's your views on that, on targets for different sectors?
I personally don't think it's helpful to have certain sectors. I think you should just make it like the Dutch or the Scandinavian made it, just boards 30%, 25, whatever you call it, period. Doesn't matter what industry, because the board is not a specialist people. If you sit on a chemical company or a bank or insurance, so you do not have to be an expert on that business. They're out of 7 or 10 or 12 board members. There's always a diversity. There is legal people, there is financial people, engineers, and what have you. So I don't think, honestly, you have to make it specific for industry per se. We should just make it the way it is, that others have done, and successfully. If you look at Scandinavia, and the number of women on board is quite up, and because of regulation. And once it's there, then it can be disconnected. The rule can be changed. That's it, khalas. So no, I don't think, honestly, to be just specific to industry. But then you create kind of discrimination. Yeah, these boards for women only, or no, this board, no, not women. No, it's not. Board is board. It's more of a generalist. It's more of looking strategically, looking at business longer term. It's not, honestly, if you run a chemical company or you run a fashion, at the end of the day, it's a balance sheet. At the end of the day, it's a net income. At the end of the day, what the company add to the society, or how the company behave in an ESG, or what's environmental, and so on. So there's really no difference, to be honest with you.
Thanks. So I'm going to paraphrase a little bit John's question, and it's really, I guess for me, it's, do you think boards around the world should be thinking a bit more creatively around gender on their boards? And what are, some of the advice you may have in terms of strategies they may use to improve these numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course. But again, I go back, if you leave it to board just to say, be good, do good things, be nice and things, that's more of a wishful thinking. It's not going to happen. I think, again, there is need for a certain push, be regulation. I mean, society pressure is building up, but it will take a long time. took a long time, and we need much faster than that, you know. So yeah, it's nice to say things will happen and we'll do that and things, but I think we need a push either through shareholders, through investment funds. You know, there's a lot of things being changed in the industry as we speak because of a lot of pressure from pension funds and active investors and these things. Once we have that, which is active here in America, but unfortunately it's not so active in other parts of the world. So if you have that kind of things, then sure, yeah, that will happen. But you know, you don't expect board to go out of their way to do these things. Like I said, their priorities looking at their dividend, share price, and you know, strategy of the business, how you're going to survive the next cycle, how you're going to do in the next downturn, and so on.
Thank you so much. There are a few more questions, but I think we're going to leave some of them for the panel discussion. So thank you so much, Mutlak. I'm going to hand over to Sheila then. Sheila, you're on mute. Sheila, you're still on mute.
Okay, thank you, Pami, on this. My thanks and appreciation for this reflective expose. And I must say that the insights that we are having today were truly helpful, ranging from, you know, having the right culture, setting the targets, having sustainable goals, quotas, mentoring, and so on. So thank you very much for that. So now it is with great honor that I will introduce our moderator for the second session. Charlotte Balle has over 35 years of experience in finance, primarily as an investment banker in Denmark and UK. She has an extensive portfolio career with a number of non-executive directorships and chair roles, as well as delivering training and advising boards in corporate governance through her company Global Governance Group. Charlotte's board roles in listed organizations have taken in the chair of Kennedy Wilson Europe Real Estate PLC, net of 3i Infrastructure PLC, and chair of Blackstone Loan Financing Limited. Charlotte's unlisted experience includes being a non-executive director of the international engineering firm Lang Walke and chair of the Institute of Directors UK. A lifelong human rights advocate, I must say, Charlotte is driven to play her part in creating an inclusive society. Being diagnosed as autistic at 52, she began advocating around neurodiversity, equality, and inclusion, working at the intersection of government, industry, and the third sector. Charlotte is also the founder and chair of Board Apprentice, a not-for-profit organization set up to improve the pipeline and diversity of board-ready directors. We are pleased once again to have you, Charlotte, here with us today. So over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and having listened into to the previous session, that was very interesting. And I really enjoyed Mutlak's input. Thank you very much for that. Refreshing.
My pleasure.
Candid and honest. It's great to hear. And I think it's through sharing these kind of things that we together can find a way to resolve this issue and come back to what nature intended, which is a balance of all voices. When we really get that into the decision-making process, I believe strongly that then we make better decisions. And we certainly make sure that we turn every stone to ensure that we do just so. I have a great panel that I'm moderating here today with some very, very experienced people who will give us some good insight into or more insights into the gender balance on boards. We have, I'm not going to go over their CVs in details. We agreed that we would rather give them more time to speak and more place for that. So we have Kevin Ramkaloan, CEO of Business Mauritius, taking part. We have Farah Fustok, CEO of Las Arts and President of 30% Club Middle East and North Africa. We also have Aruna Radhakizun, and I'm so sorry if I'm saying your names wrongly. It's my Danish background isn't helping me so much here. Chair of NCCG Mauritius, and finally Sarita Martin, non-executive director and chair from South Africa. Thank you so much for partaking in this today. I'm really looking forward to hearing all your input, and I'm absolutely sure so are all our attendees. So if we start first having a brief 5 minutes input from each of our panelists on where they see this issue going. If we can please start with Farah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to BDI for the invitation to talk today. We have some very esteemed panelists. We've heard from Mutlaq Murshid, who's an expert and you know, our role model, Mutlaq, in this topic, and we know, and a big advocate to women in the workforce and on boards.
Thank you, dear.
Maybe I'll take it from an investor perspective. So rather than quoting the numbers that everybody seems to quote and the numbers that we all know around inclusion, diversity, around the population, I think we've all seen around the inclusion of women at every level in the workforce, whether it's at the board and all the way down. We've seen the numbers that have been out by McKinsey and other consultants that talk about $12 trillion of additional GDP when it comes to women included in the workforce. And I'll take it from a recent study that was done by MSCI. MSCI did a study in October of last year. And one of the things they pointed out when they look at publicly listed companies is the fact that we're actually going backwards, and the COVID pandemic has actually deteriorated the number of women on boards. So if you look at the global level, and if you're looking at the MSCI global publicly listed companies, you've gone from 7.7% of boards that have no women on them to from 7.7 and 5.3. So you're actually going backwards. The number of boards is actually increasing where there's no women on their boards. In the emerging markets, which actually improved. So in 2019, there were 34% of the MSCI emerging market publicly listed companies with 0 women on their boards. It's now 31. But globally, this number is just too high. And I think we're almost tired of making the business case for why women need to be on boards. I think it's very clear for us that it's really more around inclusion. It's really around creating this inclusive culture. And I think Mutlaq touched on a very important point, which is it's just not a priority in the boardroom. And I think that it needs to be a priority. And the question is, who puts that at a priority? Is it the chair of the board? Or do we need one woman on the board to actually make it a priority? And I guess the most difficult thing in any change is implementation. It's the biggest challenge to any organizational change is the implementation piece. So I've worked with several organizations, whether it's 30% Club. I founded the Middle East chapter in 2015. It's now chaired by Raida, a dear friend. We've worked across multiple jurisdictions. We work very closely with BDI. You know, there's also the B20 that created the Women in Business Action Council and launched a paper last year to the G20 countries. And really one of the main, if I summarize, one of the main recommendations of the B20 paper was unlocking the advancement and full potential of women by driving reforms. So this is not about fixing women. This is about fixing the system. This is about creating and fostering an inclusive environment, creating equal and fair pay, encouraging new ways of flexible working. And you would hope that the COVID environment actually helps this. And this is completely aligned to 3 SDGs of the United Nations, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 8 on the decent work and economic growth, and SDG 9 on the industry, innovation and infrastructure. So, I mean, we go backwards round and round in circles about United Nations, about, you know, government organizations, policy papers being created. And at the end of the day, we go back to what Mutlaq is saying is we're just not seeing the change happening at the board level. And what is it that needs to happen? Is it regulatory change? And I do believe in that we do need quotas in the short term. I think quotas force the change, but quotas alone is not enough. Because we know that quotas have come out in the past, regulation has come out, and unless that regulation is implemented, enforced, measured, and tracked, then there is no change. It just drags on and on and on. So I think it's also around taking best practices from countries around the world that have made the change, from companies around the world that actually have done very well in this space, whether it's the Unilevers of the world and others that have transformed culture. And I think this is about cultural change. This is not just about having women sitting at a board level. This is about creating this inclusive culture throughout the organization, ensuring that you are recruiting fairly, that you're creating career planning, you're creating a leadership pipeline, because at the end of the day, many times when we ask why there aren't women on boards, people will say to us, well, where are the women? Well, we know there are some very credible women out there. And so we don't ever think it's an issue of supply. We really think that its issue is demand. And so whether it's the asset allocators in our part of the world, in our industry as investors, whether it's the pension funds, the central banks, the asset allocators who are allocating money to public companies, requesting these changes. So we as investors now engage with companies in the Middle East. We've created a scorecard, and we are requesting this information from companies that we invest in, because it's important for us as investors and it's important to our clients to see this change. And I think I will stop here and just hand back to you to give everybody else a chance to talk. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much for that, Farah. There's a lot of really good points coming out there on the SDG. I mean, the Blackstone board I'm chairing, we are looking very closely at it, and we're loan financing. It will eventually get to the point where we will not finance companies that has not fulfilled a certain number of the points that we expect them to fulfill, one of them being gender balance. So, so go ahead and do nothing, but your finance will be more expensive, right? And it's not far away because we are people pushing for it. So with that note, I would love to move on to Kevin, please, and hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Maybe to start that gender streaming is really a subject close to my heart. It's part of my personal history. I've been raised in a single parent household. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be able to speak on board diversity today. Maybe to start by saying also that I fully agree with what Farah has said. It's evident that we need more gender diversity on boards. I'd like to perhaps look at it, the two ways. We've been talking about quota. Maybe it's the easy way. Then there's the harder road, recognizing the value of diversity and encouraging the path towards more gender parity on the boards. Now, in a simplistic way, looking at the quota system, it's really ticking a box. I agree the supply is there, but the act itself of saying, oh, when you're choosing who to appoint, you need to appoint one woman or two or three, 10%, 20, 30%, it's ticking a box. The second part, let's call it, for the moment, let's call it the natural growth part. It requires a deeper, it's a systemic change that is required. And it really is about creating this deep understanding that diversity of leadership on boards is what brings the final shareholder value for the long term. And it's the diversity that is actually the asset there. For Mauritius, unfortunately, we've embarked on the first one on the quota system. So listed companies, public companies, and government bodies today are mandatorily required to have at least one woman on board. There's an unstated objective, but in the circles in which we discuss, the idea is to bring it to 30% at some point. But in my view, it's the longer road. It's the natural path that will, in the end, bring more value and be more sustainable over time. From my experience on boards, it's this diversity in leadership that actually brings this richness to board discussions. And this is really what is helping the board take meaningful and strategic decisions in this part of the world. And for me, I will drill it down just one level below. We've been talking about boards and women on boards, but there's a whole journey before someone gets on board, whether a man or a woman. And for me, it's about styles of leadership. Both are probably necessary, but and maybe caricaturing a little bit, There's the power leader, and then there's the servant leader. Many of us associate the leader traits with the power leader. Inspires confidence, inspires others to trust him or her and believe in him or her. But there's also a lot of effectiveness of the servant leader. The way I look at it, it's the one who inspires others to believe in themselves rather than to believe in him or her as a leader. And quite interestingly, I mean, if you look at historical point of view, the idea of leadership until quite recently used to be the servant leader. I mean, I take you back to the before the Common Era, Lao Tzu, Cicero, they were all talking about the servant leader as being the real leader. And then it's really around the 16th century that you've got Machiavelli coming with the idea of the power leader. And I will bring back to what the keynote speaker was talking about earlier on. It's about authenticity. And somewhere in a board today, some ego is important, some empathy is important. And I wouldn't necessarily classify ego as being men and empathy women. They exist in both sexes and in all the genders. But by having diversity, by having both men and women on boards, it gives us really this possibility for authentic ego empathy discussions and bring us there. But for us to be able to go towards there, we need to go a little bit further and see how to bring this natural path to make it more equal, both for women and for men. And then, unfortunately, I mean, I come from Mauritius, and we are a very well-known model of positive development, having grown from a low-income economy at independence to a high income in 2019. Participation rate of the labor force is around 70%, but gender mainstreaming is our key issue. In Mauritius, the women participation rate is around 45% compared to sub-Saharan rates of around 61.3%. And then you've got the key outliers, Kenya, Rwanda, which are in the 70s, 80s. So bringing women into the labor force itself is an issue in my country. But unfortunately for us, COVID has not helped, but is creating a disproportionate effect on female employment. The unemployment rate for women since COVID is 5% versus 3.9% for the increase in unemployment rate has been 5% for women compared to 3.9% for men, which really makes it very difficult for us. And in fact, our largest local bank, commercial bank, has a report, the MCB Focus, that actually tells us that if we're able to increase the female labor supply by 1%, we're going to increase national output by 0.9%. This really makes a case for us to bring more women into employment, to get them to grow and get to boards. So at the level of Business Mauritius, we are the largest private sector association. We represent the business community's viewpoint. We're trying to encourage gender mainstreaming at all levels. And our efforts on systemic change is really on two areas. First, around an umbrella brand that we have, which is called Signature. We are looking at inclusive growth guidelines. And inclusive is large, but in there's the gender component. And secondly, we encourage a code of people practices for our members. And in there, we also have a very strong gender element. Through Signature, we bring more subcontracting jobs to women. The idea of being able to encourage appointment of women at management levels, calculating, monitoring the gender pay, having flexible hours for mothers and single parent households. And through the Code of People Practices, we have programs on gender mainstreaming and addressing also gender-based violence, as well as programs to encourage family-friendly work practices and also parental leave as opposed to maternity leave. We see those as blocking points in the growth path in the career growth of women in our economy. We have 4 priorities for this natural path that we've been talking about. The first one is a top-level commitment. It's necessary and it has to be encouraged. Transparency, because unless we're able to measure, we won't be able to improve. A whole set of actions around the nomination committee leadership. And finally, creating the enabling environment. And that is key. Being able to have this flexibility in the work environment helps not just the women, but actually the family and the family-friendly practices. So in summary, I won't go very far. In fact, based on this, our view that if in the short term quota is required to kickstart the process, a little bit what the keynote speaker was saying. Okay, fair, fine. If we need to ignite the process externally, that makes sense. But really the change, the real change would be a mindset change. And for us, this is about being able to improve the natural path for gender mainstreaming and gender parity at all levels, to the management level and from the management levels to the board level. And for this, we believe that business associations, such as Business Mauritius, can play a meaningful role because we can accompany these changes in our membership, and we can also advocate for policy changes that can have a real and sustainable impact in the long run. I'll stop there and take over for questions. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's some great points you put out there. Yes, absolutely. I think the broader society does have to be coming behind it. And speaking as a Scandinavian, this is what we have. The whole of society is behind the equality we expect to see in society. If someone actually has opinions to the opposite, society will take them down pretty quickly. So we have that automatic leveling the playing field on an ongoing basis. We could do it, other countries can do it, but maybe we need to look into how we do the knowledge sharing and get the steps in place to get to that place. Thank you so much, Kevin. And then I'd like to move over to Aruna, please, to hear your input.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. And thank you to the 6 governance institutes for organizing this conference. A special word of thanks to Sheila and the MIUD for inviting me today. There's been some great interventions since this morning. My intervention will be principally focused on the Mauritian realities. Mauritius has adopted the National Code of Corporate Governance since 2016. It recommends that all organizations should have female directors, but it falls short of insisting on gender parity on boards. The Companies Act was amended in 2019 to provide that there should be at least one woman on the board of a public company. In today's modern world, these are perhaps 2 weak signals sent by the regulators to the corporate world. Let us now turn to some gender statistics regarding Mauritius. The Gender Statistics Report 2020, issued by the Statistics Office of Mauritius, highlighted a number of matters. In 2020, women outnumbered men as they lived on average 6.8 years longer than men. The Gender Parity Index showed no disparity in the schooling of boys and girls for pre-primary, primary, and secondary levels. Girls generally perform better than boys at higher school certificate examinations. Consequently, more women than men are enrolled in tertiary institutions. In 2020, 45.3% of women of working age were in the labor force, compared to 69.3% of men. Women were more likely than men to be employees. Women were also less likely than men to work for themselves. Female unemployment rate in 2020 stood at 11.1%, much higher than the rate of 7.8% for male. Interestingly, unemployed women were generally more qualified than their male counterparts. Women were also largely unrepresented in decision-making at higher spheres of Mauritian society. The percentage of women among cabinet ministers stood at 12.5%. That is 3 out of 24 ministers. Interestingly, the report also revealed that more women are holding senior positions in government services, positions such as Senior Chief Executive, Permanent Secretary, Deputy Permanent Secretary, Director, Manager, Judge, and Magistrate. This proportion increased from 23.1% in 2000 to 39.7% in 2020. The Corn Ferry survey carried out this year on directors' fees and board composition reveals that out of 53 companies surveyed in the private sector, the presence of women in directorship roles continues to increase from 4.58% in 2014 to 13% in 2021. In 2014, there were no female board chairmen, whereas in 2021, 6% of chair roles are filled by women. The stats speak for themselves. The public sector in Mauritius is faring much better than the private sector, sorry. So what lessons could Mauritius Inc. draw from the public sector? Firstly, women choose the public sector in Mauritius because it is perceived as more transparent, objective, and meritocratic. Once you have been recruited at a certain position within the public sector, you're considered worthy to reach the top, and you advance automatically over time in your career with no glass ceiling or discrimination issues. Women are often less comfortable with the aggressive, competitive cultures prevailing in the private sector. Women tend to drive their career choice by practical consideration, economic independence, stability, and from this perspective, the public sector is perceived as a safe harbor. The gender wage gaps are lower in the public sector. There is also gender equality and equity. If a female civil servant reached a level required to be assigned tasks and responsibilities, they are given the opportunity to do so. The private sector can lead women's economic empowerment by implementing policies that resolve pay inequity in the workplace and help eliminate broader gender disparities in the workplace. Female civil servants, once they reach a certain level, are automatically given the opportunity to sit on boards of parastatal entities. They represent their ministries and participate in decision-making at board meetings. This is not the case for senior female executives in the private sector. My recommendations going forward would be as follows. Firstly, for organizations to work on and communicate their corporate culture. Values, such as an inclusive approach, meritocracy and transparency are attractive to women employees. Secondly, training and mentoring. The Mauritius Institute of Directors already runs a director development course, which is a must for aspiring female directors. Also, if all chairs of boards and committees were to groom one aspiring female director, then corporate Mauritius would be in a much better place. Thirdly, making an inclusive approach a priority for boards. The private sector often complains about the lack of a pool of competent female directors to source from, and yet organizations already employ many women at lower and middle management level. The pool is there already. After all, not all male directors appointed on boards are super performers. They become better over time. So why not give the chance to and empower those women managers to grow professionally and naturally enter boardrooms and learn along the way? I am not personally in favor of introducing a quota system in Mauritius. I favor more organizations voluntarily setting their own targets to bridge the gender gap. Some private sector companies have started taking the lead in this manner. We heard early on Johnpierre talking about Ciel Group, which has publicly announced its clear targets to bridge the gender gap. The largest local bank, the Mauritius Commercial Bank, has also publicly announced its target to reach gender parity, that is 40% by 2030 at all levels of decision-making within the bank. These are encouraging signs from the private sector, and I remain optimistic for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Aruna. It's good to see some of these comparisons in the statistics, and I think we can all learn from that. I'm seeing from the comments that we have similar situation in other countries where it seems to be very easier in the public sector versus the private sector for women to advance. So certainly something for the private sector to learn from. And good that we have different views on quotas. it's I think it's a good ignition from my point of view, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I've been working on this for so many years. I'm getting a bit tired of pushing the same thing 15 years later, and we haven't moved enough. If leaders really can't figure it out, we've got to put a law in place. That's what we did when we got the vote. Maybe this is what we need to do here, but it's good to have different opinions on that. And finally, I will move over to Sarita, please, for your input.
Thanks, Charlotte. It's wonderful listening to everybody from this morning, and I think I'm just going to build on what everybody else has been saying. The one thing I do want to start off with that struck me, as I think Kevin mentioned, just be yourself and be authentic. And Dr. Zeus says, be yourself because everyone else is taken. I think just being authentic in the boardroom and as an individual and as a human being will make all the difference. We can't pretend to be, we are human beings and we can't pretend to be anything else than we are. We see it coming through in our language, we see it coming through in the behaviors. And at the end of the day, we can talk to the end of the earth about quotas and about changing mindsets, but we all come from a history, we all come from a background, we all come from a legacy. And I've been asked to speak to this topic from a South African perspective. And many of you are aware of South Africa's history and where we came from and entering democracy in 1994. There was a quote that said, diversity may be the hardest thing for a society to live with, but perhaps the most dangerous thing for society to be without. And I think that that's really profound, because within South Africa, we moved into democracy in 1994. We've had all the pieces of legislation. We've had the Employment Equity Act from 1998. We've had the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. We've had the Black Economic Act that's come around. It hasn't changed people's behavior, because I don't think people change because they're forced to change. I think people change because they want to change. And so it is about just a more emotional maturity, I think, that is required from individuals sitting around the boardroom table. And there was reference made to nominations committees and to chairs, and on the boards that I've sat and from the Institute of Directors of South Africa, where we do board evaluations and nominations committees, people appoint people who look, feel, think the same as themselves. And that is what we've noticed. So you do need great leadership from your chair in order to see this change coming through. That's the only way in which it does come through. In South Africa, we have made progress. Aruna mentioned, public sector in Mauritius making good progress. And we have seen a change in public sector, but you wonder if the change is real or if it is at face value, if actually those women have a voice, or are they just a statistic? In the private sector, we have lots of companies listed on our companies registry. We have very few listed entities, and our Johannesburg Stock Exchange does have a diversity policy in place. So we are starting to see reluctant change coming through. We have more than 50% of our population being female. Colleen is the expert on gender, our 30% club and the statistics. But at the end of the day, I disagree that we cannot find the skills that we need. It's where you look. When nominations committees say, well, we can't find the skills, and then I look at the individuals that come through our programs at the Institute of Directors that are so well qualified, articulate, personable, have amazing personalities, that understand their fiduciary responsibilities as directors, that are investing in themselves. And so nominations committees, I think, need a more formal and transparent process, and not just asking the directors around the table, well, who do you know that we can look at? I mean, we all know that happens, so From a democracy perspective in South Africa, it was forced upon us as we went into democracy. And it's a movement that led to a better country, although you've watched the news over the last few weeks, and you can see that we don't always get it right. You can regulate against racism and sexism and harassment, etc., but it doesn't necessarily mean that people's attitudes and views and behaviors are going to change. We've got a great governance code in the King Code, even from King 1 to King 4. And, at the end of the day, again, the delegates often say, so why don't we create this as legislation? It's like, you've got more than 3,000 pieces of legislation. What's going to change? You have to be able to monitor and enforce. And we've seen the name and shame that goes on, but also just do the right thing. I think as organizations, from an ethical perspective, it is the right thing to do. Diversity on boards is the right thing to do. Why? Because the collective wisdom that many of my colleagues around the table and that have spoken before have referred to brings about a richness of debate and discussion. And, just hearing somebody else's view, although it might not be my view, just, creates a different thought process. We've seen a lot of female CEOs in South Africa. We've seen a lot of female ministers in South Africa. We've also had Thuli Madonsela as our public protector, who is very, very well regarded. But we have also seen female directors that have resigned off boards because of sexism, because of the manner in which they were treated, because they did not have a voice. And when you go through a nominations process as a director, you can read the integrated report, you can read everything that's on Google, you can have a wonderful interview, but at the end of the day, when you sit on that boardroom table and your chair doesn't give you a voice, you feel totally helpless. And so we've seen a number of female directors that have actually stepped down. But, so as I said, it all starts with how directors are appointed. Who's doing that appointment? Who's sitting on that nominations committee? Where are they looking for those individuals? Because there are wonderful directors out there, both male and female. And diversity is not about male and female. It is about the difference in thinking. If you look at the definition of diversity, I would also say that, you need courage. It takes a lot of courage to be a director. It takes a lot of courage to make your views known in the face of apparent adversity, and a chair who does not want to give you that opportunity, or to go against, to buck the trend in a way. And that is one of the attributes that we look for in directors. But you can't really in a nominations committee ask someone, do you have courage? It's like asking someone, are you a person of integrity? It makes absolutely no sense. You have to test it, and you have to test their behavior. And you have to, I think, as directors, both male and female, you have to believe in yourself. You have to believe in your value system, what you will stand for, what you will not stand for. I know from a personal perspective, and I was asked to share my personal perspective as well, that there are boards that I will not sit on or that I have turned down. Why? Because the individual sitting around the table did not give me the impression that I would actually have a voice to make a valuable contribution. And so I believe in myself. I think I don't mention the pay gap. And our South African Remuneration Association just put out a statement to say that the pay gap is still there, even though we have legislation against it and we're looking at that Gini coefficient, but it's about prejudice, and that's what the chair was quoted as saying. It's about prejudice. So yeah, it's like, who do you want to see sitting around your boardroom table? The other thing is that, diversity and inclusion needs to be top of mind for boards. And so when we talk about ESG, for example, that's part of ESG. We can't just talk about it from a theoretical perspective. We have to talk about living it as an organization. We have to talk about it as believing in it as an organization and not just ticking the box. I think those organizations that tick the box will never be sustainable. At some point in time, the truth will come out. Truth always comes to the top. And as I said, in South Africa, we've got diversity policies. We've we've got every policy under the sun, as well as every piece of legislation with regard to diversity. But at the end of the day, if nobody believes in it, and our boards have historically, and this is what I see in evaluations, they have historically got into bad habits. And so it is difficult to change. Until you change the leadership, you don't see a change coming through on boards. Or in organizations, even CEOs of organizations. So, you know, they believe that what they're doing is right. This is what we're going to look at. And again, talking about ESG, but then when you listen to what they speak about, they're only focusing on the finance. They're not focusing on the environmental. They're not focusing on the social, you know, so that's really important that we actually understand that we believe in this and that we're going to do it. And when we listen to the language, we need to hear that language of governance come through. So yeah, I don't think there's a lot of diversity around boardroom tables. But, you know, they say that diversity is having a seat on the table, and inclusion is being active, and belonging is actually being heard. And I don't think that at this point in time, many boards are able, hand over heart, to say that their directors belong. I think that they might fill a statistic, you might look really good on paper, but at the end of the day, you know, organizations and boards and chairs really don't believe in diversity. Just on the quota system, again, I don't know what quotas do besides tick a box. You know, might, as the keynote speaker said, might be that nuclear explosion that we needed. But again, if you don't really believe it, and if you're not going to be an ethical organization, and if you're not going to do the right thing, don't do it. So that's my view, Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. That was lovely input and passionate. It's always great to hear. I mean, chairs should really be leading in attracting people or trying to get people in that doesn't fit in. That's diversity. If they fit in with all of the rest of the board, then you're not diverse, right? Get someone who challenges you, who disagrees. Disagreement is good. It's not a problem. It's a good opportunity to grow. And so we must welcome disagreements. We must welcome people. One of my sort of mottos is hire someone who doesn't fit in, because that is the only way we get that cognitive difference, that difference of thinking. I've had it myself many times, obviously being autistic, which I went public with last year. I tend to think differently and I tend to behave differently. And for some people, that's very scary. And some boards have said they wouldn't take me because I scared the life out of the board members. So, you know, how are we to be? We are just to be ourselves. And as you said, authenticity is really key. There's some interesting questions and comments coming through. So one of them was, how much impact do you think a female chair makes to the gender mix on the board? And just for my own sort of few pennies, once I started being a chair sort of 12 years ago, that's often what I get approached for. None of my boards are undiverse, none of them. I make sure that doesn't happen. It is the board's role and responsibility to ensure that it's a diverse board. If you're on a board that isn't, if I was on one and it was impossible and I continued to be the only woman, maximum 2 years on that, then I'm gone. And by now regulators will know if I leave, why I leave. If I leave after 2 years, there's an issue. And people know well enough that that will be the case. And we can all lead by example. So I wanted to pass over to each one of you for sort of a sentence on, would it make a difference if we had female chairs? From your own experience.
Yeah, I personally think so, because the chair always leads the board and sets the direction. And therefore, definitely it does. And we can't, let's not be naive and think just be goody and it will happen and companies should do and companies should, it's not gonna happen. Like we talked about, boards look at finance, we like it or not. Unless there is something to force that behavior to change, that's it. We as investors, we look at return on our investments, don't we? Do we really go invest in a company that's just great in ESG, doing this, but gives you zero dividend, zero capital gains? You don't. Let's be frank. And if you do, you must be an exception. The 99.99 is looking for return on investment. And therefore, we have to be realistic and face reality and understand what's out there and what drives board, what drives decision-making, what drives the business. And for sure, having a lady on the board chair, being a chairman, will definitely change things, no question about it. But first, how to get them there? We have to be, I mean, you know, it just doesn't happen by itself. You know, going back to nuclear reaction, you can produce a huge amount of power, but it frankly won't happen without an ignition. And therefore, we need something, call it regulation, call it quota, call it what you call it. But if we leave it to just business as usual, it will happen eventually, but we'll all be dead by then. Like economists say, everything will be equal in the long term. But in the long term, we're all dead. So economics have to look at the short term also, not just be thinking long term. And that's what I think, honestly.
Thank you, Mutlaq. Any other comments from the panelists?
I would actually disagree, Mutlaq. Sorry to disagree with you, but I think one thing is the elephant in the room, that there is something called the princess syndrome, that some women don't support other women. And therefore, a woman sitting in a chair position who's not supportive of other women does not help the case. Then again, a woman that does support needs to make sure it's on the agenda. And I will also disagree with you that there is such a thing as shareholder value, not just return on investment. And to many people, stakeholder value is beyond shareholder value. And I think more and more as investors, we want to see the value across the board. So we believe that companies that do have an inclusive board, that do have inclusive policies, do deliver better returns in the long term. And I think that's been proven along many companies. In the Middle East, I would agree that's very, very early stage, and we don't have a track record. But I think in many countries around the world, there are companies that have really focused on stakeholder value and have delivered better value to their shareholders.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. If I could just say, Mutlaq, I also disagree with you. And I support what Farah is saying. One is ESG is a global movement at this point in time. We are even starting to see organizations such as BlackRock come out, you know, the CEO with an annual letter, and there is a focus on ESG. It is no longer just about the financials. It is about the long-term sustainability of an organization. Perhaps part of it is about, it's actually about value creation. You know, if you look at climate change, at the end of the day, you know, when we look at KPIs of our executives, and we only have financial KPIs or strategic KPIs, they make absolutely no sense, because what are you doing about the culture within the organization? What are you doing about the impact of your organization on society? And how are we measuring that? And we know what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. That's the bottom line. The second thing to your question, Charlotte, is I don't think it makes a difference whether there's a female chair or there's a male chair. I think what you need is you need the right chair. And with the right attitude, the right mindset, the right approach, the right behavior, because the tone is set from the top. And there was that famous book written about a fish rots from its head, you know, and that tone is set at the top. And if you have the wrong chair with the wrong personality, who does not have the ability to communicate with all directors and to be able to get the best, you know, my very elderly aunt, she's 90, says the 5 fingers are not the same, but they all contribute. And so every director around that table needs to contribute. There is no room for, you know, those individuals that come in there and they want director fees and they want the status. You have to make a contribution. So to my point, I, for example, on some boards, I'm the only female. Sometimes I'm the chair, you know, but at the end of the day, you know, you have to value everyone around the room. And so it depends on the individual rather than whether you are male, female, or anything else. Thank you.
Charlotte, if I may, I mean, I also very much agree with what Sarita is saying in terms of it doesn't matter if it's a man or woman. What is important is the attitude. I'll just go a little bit further. I think having a woman on a board, I mean, what's the objective? The objective is not to have just women on the board. The real objective is to have more gender parity across organizations. And really, I think the way we could do this is if we're able to set the agenda. The ESGs are one, but within the ESG, to be able to understand that inclusive growth is what is actually building shareholder value in the long term. Stakeholder value, but also shareholder value. It's about impact investment, but it's also about long-term return on investment and value of the company. So I think to be able to do that is what really is the difference and what really would make the difference. We've done it in Mauritius based on climate change. So we've ensured that we've created some facilities where there's blended loans, blended facilities for investments that are towards climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And now we're moving it to another level where there's also a gender component to it. By having this cross-cutting view of how the gender issue or the gender mainstreaming impacts on overall investment, and making sure that on all investments, on all decisions, this is part of the considerations, I think we'll reach much quicker and faster to the end objective of gender mainstreaming, and just by saying, let's have a chairperson who's a woman on a board. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps just one small contribution. I think in countries where the stats are very low in terms of gender parity, getting women to chair boards, be it private sector, public sector, parastatal bodies, does have a plus in terms of being there as a role model for the other women to muster the courage to go up. I've had a few chances of being, I don't know it's a chance, but of being the first woman chair on a number of boards. And that's the feeling that ladies come up to me and say, and they feel they can and so on. And I find also sometimes when you have women who chair, they're actually more result-oriented, goal-driven, the boards get wrapped up quickly, it's business. It's a different way of leading, I suppose, and that helps overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I would hope it doesn't make any difference, ideally, right? We just have the right person who does the right thing. It just is that so far, that's not what we've seen. So that tells us something, just looking at the past. So something else is needed, whatever that something else might be, but certainly something else. And what is it they say? More of the same thinking that it gives a different outcome is insanity, right? So maybe we need to be clear on gender parity in terms of female labor participation as well. I mean, who's driving that? Who will drive that if we haven't got leaders that are balanced male, female? Leaders need to lead. That's why we are leaders. If we are sitting on a board and thinking we are not there to lead, we are wrong. Step off, right? Don't be there if you think you're there just to be there. You're there to lead and stand up. And sometimes that means you get a slap in the face if you say something people disagree with. And that's part of the game. That's part of it. And we all need to just deal with that. There was another question around how do we address the groupthink mentality? Some of what's been said already has addressed that in a way, but I don't know what you as panelists, what your thoughts might be on trying to disperse of the groupthink mentality. Sarita? Thanks,
Charlotte. You know, that groupthink mentality has often been built over a number of years. And as I said, you know, historically, if you got the same people who are appointing people that look like them, think like them, etc., you're going to get the groupthink mentality. You also need individuals to have that ability, that courage to break that groupthink, to bring a different perspective. And so I think once you start to see changes on boards with diversity in every respect, including millennials. I see there was a question around, you know, younger individuals on boards. They bring a totally different perspective. I mean, I could be a mother of a millennial. You know, they think so differently that it is not the manner in which I have been brought up to think. And so I think the more we see this this wave of change coming through, which does scare a lot of people because they think automatically that they're going to become non-executive director. Although our CPWC has changed their retirement policy now, you're no longer forced to retire at 62. Once you start to see a different mix of skills, of race, of gender, of diversity, of thinking, and more of that those non-financial individuals on boards, I think you will see a natural break in groupthink if the individuals appointed have the courage to go against the trend.
Thank you. That's a big if, because it's always a bit scary and people feel they're risking the position they fought so hard for. But it's worth it. It's easier to look yourself in the mirror. Any other comments on the groupthink?
I think it's not that easy. Like I said, you need something to push it. We all human. We all like to do things the way we've done before. It's comfortable. Change is always uncomfortable for us. We like it or not. And therefore, we need some kind of an outside push to move things. And it's very typical. You sit in boards, we all sit in boards and so on. And people get together, they think alike, they like the people who think like them. It's a human nature. And it gravitates to think kind of herd mentality. And that's sometimes quite dangerous. But unfortunately, you need some outside, either a chair who's really enlightened, which is not in many cases, to be frankly honest. This is a rare commodity to find, to push that board out of the comfort zone. And therefore, we need some sort of shareholder push, institutional push, something that needs to be done, to be honest. If we wait for it to happen naturally, it will take a long time.
It's not going to happen. I've leaned a lot on John Cotter and his change, 8 steps for change. We haven't even reached the first 2. First one is sense of urgency, which we'll only get when we have enough dissatisfaction. Then there'll be a social hit somehow, right? And then the second step is a powerful coalition. So without those 2, we get nowhere. And I'm not sure we have those 2. I'm not sure we have them. So we need to consider, how do we get the sense of urgency in place so that it actually happens? Last year's Black Lives Matters changed the conversation, certainly on many of my boards, with regards to ethnic minority and how we solve that issue, because we now had a social rising. Are we really going to wait for yet other social risings from women, especially wanting equality? What about the leaders just doing it before that happens? But how do we get that urgency, right? That's the problem.
Charlotte, I would just add that I think we are all responsible. Each one of us, each and every one of us that sits on a board is responsible to make that change. So we can always kind of put it down to the leaders. We can put it down to the system. We can put it down to intervention, and of course all these things can help. But every single one of us that sits in these events, that talks, that sits on boards, I would like to think that there is a call to action when we step out of this panel and say, we've learned a lot. This is transformational. This is really interesting. A lot of it we've heard before. We know what the answers are. We know what the solutions are. Why are we as individuals not changing? Why are we as individuals, whether it's myself on a board, Mutlaq on a board, why are we not making sure, yourself, Charlotte, on boards, you've stepped off, rather than stepping off, why are we not forcing the change, changing the dialogue, making sure that we are agents of change? We are, I believe, responsible for every single board that we sit on to make that change. So walking away is one solution, and go and change it somewhere else. And staying there and having the courage to talk up and create a dialogue and create that imperative for change, because it makes business sense, is also an option. And I think that is our responsibility.
Absolutely, I agree on that, and thank you for pointing that out. I would add that I only step off when it's absolutely impossible, and sometimes stepping off is also a show that makes change happen, because that's what
absolutely.
Yeah, but you have to sometimes take it to the line, and that makes people get out of the chair bit and think, okay, let's make sure that doesn't happen again. So it's setting a stance, but you're right, continuing to influence all of us. Sorry, Kevin.
No, Charlotte, I was going to say, I think this is the most difficult part of everything. This is really the most difficult question, because groupthink is mindset. And it's true, you have more affinity with someone who you can think you can go out and have a beer with, have a chat with. And of course, if it's a male-dominated boardroom, there are many more affinities among men than women. But at the same time, the mindset change, and the real way to change it. I mean, if we had equality at board level and we had two groups of men and women, each one happy in their corner, that also doesn't help. What we need to is really to understand that we are better together, that there is this need to have diversity. I heard Mr. Mauritius saying early on that, you know, it's a little bit wishy-washy long term, and all that. It's true. I do recognize that this is a very long-term change. But in my view, mindset is where we need to focus, and that comes through a variety of instruments. Obviously, programs. Obviously, even you know, conferences like this. But we need to be able to instill this understanding that we need the diversity to be better. And this is probably the best time to do it, because diversity today is not binary. Today, diversity, and I think Sarita was talking to us about that a little bit early on. We talk about sexuality, pan-diversity with the millennials, but also with this changing gender-neutral the new technologies. I mean, as an investor, you know you're going to areas to invest where you don't know anything about. The Facebooks, the GAFIs of this world are the ones that are actually making all the returns. None of us are technology savvy to the level of understanding that a Snapchat is worth more than a Mediclinic, but it is. And this is why we will need to embrace diversity. And hopefully through this mega change that's happening, we will also change faster, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to the end of the session. Thank you so much for all of you. It was a great conversation, and I saw it more as a conversation which I found really enjoyable, and with all your different inputs. I happen to be a single mom of 3 kids, which I've been for 11 years whilst judging my career with it. My youngest is 17, it's a daughter, and I do have a big struggle explaining to her why she will get paid less for the same work. It's consistently in the top of the class, well above all the boys at this stage. So it's hard to explain to our younger generations why. Why is it that you are worth less than men or than the boys you've gone to school with throughout your school career? And when she says to me, why, Mom, I had no answer. I had no answer. I want to have an answer, and I want to be able to say, we fixed it. We, us, the leaders of the generation that can fix it. That's what I want to be able to say. So thank you so much for all of you to take part. Thank you so much for having me here. I really enjoyed it. Well done to all the director organizations putting this together. It's a necessary thing to keep talking about. And after this comes many other diversities and equalities that we need to talk about too. But this is a good starting point. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Charlotte, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all the panelists and the speakers that we've had today. You've absolutely done a fantastic job. Thank you so much. I'd just like to say also, as I sum up, thank you to Sheila and Palmy for helping us organise today's event, but thank you to Kamla for all her encouragement in the event previously, and we're looking forward to Carly and Kirsten's event on the 11th of August, so that will be the third and final one as we look at corporate governance policies that support women, so trying to bring it all together to a conclusion and hopefully having some really strong action points to take away. But thank you to everybody. We've heard the passion on all sides. We've had some great insights. I love, we've got to ignite this nuclear reaction. I think the optimism that Helen brought at the beginning as well. but I personally am a great believer in setting those targets and having some regulation, but some firm regulation in order to kickstart the change that we need to see. And I think that we've seen in those countries where they've brought in those regulations, voluntary or not, mandatory or voluntary, it has changed, it has moved the needle, it has made the change that we're looking for. We've heard that this isn't a supply problem, it's a demand issue. So how do we change the conversation at the board? We need more advocacy, and all the institutes that are here are participating in this event are those advocates on your behalf with the regulators on a regular basis. But we've heard that the investors are also having a greater say, and that ESG is going to push these things forward. And I think that is extremely important and very encouraging, but it's still not enough. We need more men in the conversation. We definitely need more men. We have men like Mutlak, who has been an advocate for women on boards for a long time, and has had a lot of courage to encourage that in not always very easy situations. But there are many other men out there who are supportive, but we need them also to speak up. I love Charlotte's board apprenticeship. We need mentoring, we need coaching. We need to get the chairman to put this on the board agenda. We need the NRC to be tasked with focusing on inclusion. It is their responsibility to lead this for the board. And of course, it's the right thing to do. But Charlotte, we need to fix it. I want to see my daughter or my granddaughter having equal pay, having equality, and not being the only woman in the room, for sure. So we need to do something, and we can do this together. We're gathering momentum, but we need to keep our foot on the pedal. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you to the GCC BDI team behind the scenes, because they've brought you all together today and made it all technically possible. And I know it's a lot of work, guys and girls, but thank you so much for all that you've done. And thank you to everybody. We look forward to seeing you for the third one. Do not miss it, the 11th of August. See you all there.